Just once I want to fly. The voice whispered in his memory, the words suspended in time like an aircraft waiting for clearance. The morning fractured with sound metal clanking against metal boarding announcements echoing through cavernous halls, the steady hum of thousands of lives intersecting in transit. At Gate B14 of New York's JFK Airport, where hundreds of passengers waited for Sky Dream Airlines Flight 218 to San Francisco, one man stood motionless amid the rush, his eyes fixed beyond the fogged glass. Thomas Bennett, 48, wore a simple navy blazer over a white button-down shirt. No designer labels, no luxury watch glinting at his wrist, just a worn leather briefcase, the letters TB barely visible on the handle. To the hurried eye, he looked like any other business traveler. Nothing announced that this unassuming man had built SkyDream Airlines from a two-plane operation into the fifth largest carrier in the country. Nothing revealed that within 10 minutes he would make a decision that would halt operations across an entire airline and make headlines nationwide. The early light caught the edge of aircraft wings outside, transforming ordinary metal into something luminous. Thomas watched the ground crew prepare the plane, his plane, though none of them knew it. Every quarter he boarded flights unannounced, an anonymous passenger observing the airline he'd created. Not for show, not for a publicity stunt, but to ensure that the promise at the core of SkyDream remained intact, respect in the skies for everyone. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers. Thomas joined the line, boarding pass in hand. His eyes caught the SkyDream logo, a simple horizon line with wings extending upward. He'd sketched that design himself 15 years ago, back when people said a black man from Queens had no business trying to build an airline. Back when bankers laughed him out of conference rooms. Back when his vision of an airline that treated every passenger with equal respect seemed impossible. Now boarding our first-class passengers, and those needing special assistance, announced the gate agent, her voice professionally pleasant. Thomas stepped forward, boarding pass extended. The agent scanned it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Something in her glance lingered a half-second too long. Thomas had lived long enough to recognize that look, the subtle assessment, the silent question. Does he belong? He nodded his thanks and walked down the jet bridge, wheeling his small carry-on behind him. The familiar weight of his father's briefcase hung from his right hand, a talisman that had followed him from community college classrooms to executive boardrooms. His father had carried it through 30 years as a postal worker, and before him, Thomas's grandfather had used it during his time as one of the first black accountants at a major New York firm. As Thomas stepped onto the aircraft, the lead flight attendant's greeting faltered for a barely perceptible moment. Her eyes performed the same quick assessment the gate agents had. Thomas noted it but said nothing. He never did. The real measure of service wasn't how they treated him when they knew who he was. It was how they treated him when they thought he was nobody special at all. Before we dive deeper into what happens next, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below telling us your city and country. And if you've ever felt that moment when someone questions whether you belong somewhere, hit that like button. This story might be exactly what you need to hear today. Thomas settled into seat 2A, placing his briefcase carefully in the overhead bin. The leather was cracked at the edges, the brass buckles dulled by decades of use. As his fingers traced the worn initials, his mind drifted back to another time at this very same airport. He was 9 years old, waiting on a hard plastic bench past midnight. His mother, Elaine Bennett, was finishing her shift mopping floors in Terminal 4. He watched her through heavy-lidded eyes, her uniform too big for her slight frame, her movements efficient after years of practice. Though exhaustion lined her face, she always paused by the floor-to-ceiling windows when her supervisor wasn't looking, staring at the planes with naked longing. "Just once I want to fly," she'd whispered that night, not realizing her son could hear her. "Just to know what it feels like to be above the clouds." Elaine Bennett cleaned airport floors for 22 years, but never once boarded a plane. Commercial flight remained a luxury beyond her reach, even as she scrubbed the floors walked upon by those who took flying for granted. "I'll take you someday," Mama Thomas had promised her when he was 13. She'd laughed, ruffling his hair. "Don't worry about me, Tommy. You just focus on your studies. Get yourself somewhere I couldn't go." Thomas had done just that. Every scholarship opportunity, every extra credit assignment, every chance to advance, he seized them all. Community college while working part-time at the same airport where his mother cleaned, a degree in business, an entry-level position with a regional carrier, slowly climbing until he understood every aspect of airline operations. By 30, he was developing business plans. By 35, he had convinced 2 investors to back his vision for a different kind of airline, one built on the radical notion that all passengers deserved respect regardless of what they paid or who they were. When his first aircraft, an aging 737, bought from a bankrupt charter company, took off from JFK to Chicago, his mother had been too ill to attend the ceremony. "Describe it to me," she'd asked from her hospital bed. "Tell me what it feels like when it takes off." "Like freedom." "Mama," he'd told her, holding her thin hand. "Like everything that's holding you down suddenly doesn't matter anymore." She'd died 2 months later, never having experienced that feeling herself. At her funeral, Thomas had made a silent vow. SkyDream wouldn't just be another airline. It would be a monument to the respect his mother deserved but never received. When traditional airline executives scoffed at his policies, no overbooking, standardized service protocols across all cabin classes, merit-based hiring that resulted in the most diverse staff in the industry, Thomas held firm. When quarterly profits lagged behind competitors who cut corners, he refused to compromise. "We're not just selling tickets," he told his team. "We're selling humanity in the skies." Against all odds, SkyDream survived its difficult early years. Passengers who experienced the difference in service became loyal advocates. Word spread. The fleet expanded from 1 aging 737 to 30 modern aircraft serving 42 cities. Industry veterans who had dismissed Thomas as an idealistic novice began studying his business model. Yet success brought new challenges. As the company grew to over 5,000 employees, Thomas worried that his founding vision might get diluted. That's when he instituted his quarterly anonymous flights boarding as a regular passenger, observing how his staff treated people when they didn't know the boss was watching. Most times he felt proud of what he saw. Sometimes he noticed areas for improvement. But never had he witnessed anything that made him question the fundamental integrity of his airline. Until today. As Thomas adjusted his seatbelt, he wondered what his mother would think of the empire he'd built in her honor. Would she recognize the values she'd instilled in him? Respect, perseverance, integrity, and the company that now bore the motto, "Equal respect for all." He was about to find out. Have you ever made a promise to someone that shaped your entire life's work? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe that true respect should be available to everyone, not just those who can afford it, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The first-class cabin filled slowly. Thomas observed each passenger as they arrived, a silver-haired executive type arranging his expensive briefcase with practiced care, a middle-aged couple in coordinated designer travel wear consulting their phones, a young woman in a power suit who looked barely out of college, likely enjoying her first corporate-approved upgrade. Thomas pulled out his notebook, an actual paper notebook, not a tablet or phone. Another habit inherited from his father, who believed important things should be written by hand. He jotted down his initial impressions of the flight crew. The captain's announcement had been warm and confident. The lead flight attendant's welcome was professional but somewhat automatic. 2 other attendants were preparing the galley, their movements efficient. A flight attendant approached, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, uniform, impeccably pressed, SkyDream wings pin gleaming on her lapel. According to her name tag, she was Vanessa Thompson. Thomas recognized her type immediately, rigorously trained, detail-oriented, proud of her position. She was exactly the kind of employee who helped build SkyDream's reputation for excellence. "Good morning, sir," she said, her smile practiced. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage?" "Just water, please," Thomas replied. Something flickered across Vanessa's expression, so brief anyone else might have missed it. A subtle reassessment. Her eyes performed a quick inventory. His simple navy blazer, not designer. His button-down shirt, crisp but not expensive. His leather briefcase, quality but well-worn. "Of course," she said, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly, slightly cooler, slightly less engaged. She moved to the passenger across the aisle, the silver-haired executive in seat 1B. "Good morning, sir. Welcome back to SkyDream. Mr. Crawford, isn't it? Your usual bourbon before takeoff. You remembered Vanessa? You're always so attentive." The man beamed clearly, pleased to be recognized. Thomas made another note in his book. The difference wasn't dramatic, but it was there. The warmth extended to the recognized regular, the slight coolness toward the unfamiliar passenger who didn't immediately present as wealthy or important. When Vanessa returned with his water, she placed it on his armrest without meeting his eyes, already turning toward another passenger. Thomas thanked her anyway, observing as she fussed over the silver-haired man, chatting about his recent trip to London. More passengers filed in. A young Hispanic woman, Maria Gonzalez, according to her name tag, worked efficiently in the galley. She glanced occasionally into the cabin, her expression neutral but attentive. Thomas sipped his water, continuing to observe. This was his ritual: watching, noting, learning. The true measure of SkyDream wasn't how they treated the passengers they recognized as valuable. It was how they treated everyone else. The cabin doors closed. The safety demonstration began professional, thorough. Thomas noted that Maria made eye contact with each passenger during her section of the demonstration, while Vanessa's gaze seemed to skip past him entirely. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Thomas felt the familiar surge of pride. Every departure was a small miracle of logistics engineering and human coordination. He never lost his appreciation for the complex dance that put aircraft in the sky. The engines hummed to life. Outside his window, ground crew in bright yellow vests cleared away equipment. One worker looked up, giving the aircraft a small salute. Thomas smiled. Every role mattered, from the pilots to the ground handlers to the cleaners who prepared the cabin for the next flight. His mother had taught him that. The plane taxied toward the runway, joining the queue of aircraft waiting for takeoff. In his peripheral vision, Thomas noticed Vanessa conferring with another attendant, Greg Sullivan, according to his name tag. Their glances kept returning to him. Something in their manner raised the fine hairs on the back of his neck, a sensation he knew well, the subtle awareness of being discussed, assessed, perhaps judged. The plane accelerated down the runway. As always, Thomas felt that moment of transcendence as the wheels left the ground. No matter how many flights he took, that instant of defying gravity never lost its magic. For a breath, he was that 9-year-old boy again, watching planes with his mother, dreaming impossible dreams. The magic lasted until the seatbelt sign turned off with a cheerful ding. Then Vanessa Thompson approached his seat again, this time with Greg Sullivan beside her. Thomas Bennett's quarterly ritual was about to take an unexpected turn. Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced that subtle change in how someone treats you based on assumptions about who you are. And if you're enjoying this story, give it a thumbs up so others can find it too. Excuse me, sir. Vanessa's voice cut through the ambient cabin noise. She stood in the aisle beside Greg Sullivan, both of them positioned as if forming a small barrier between Thomas and the rest of the first-class cabin. May I see your boarding pass again? Thomas looked up from his notebook, his expression neutral. Is there a problem? Greg Sullivan, about 42, with a perfectly trimmed beard and the confident posture of someone who took his authority seriously, offered what might have been meant as a reassuring smile. "Just a routine verification, sir. We like to make sure all our passengers are in their assigned seats." Thomas noted that no other passengers were being asked for this routine verification. He reached for his boarding pass in his jacket pocket and handed it over. "Seat 2A as assigned." Vanessa examined the boarding pass with unusual scrutiny, turning it over as if expecting to find something written on the back. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You boarded in our first priority group?" "Yes," Thomas replied simply. Across the aisle in seat 1B, William Crawford looked up from his financial newspaper, not bothering to hide his interest in the exchange. He caught Vanessa's eye and raised an eyebrow in silent communication. In row 3, a woman with short auburn hair and intelligent eyes watched the interaction while pretending to scroll through her phone. Sarah Anderson, 42, had spent 15 years as a corporate HR consultant specializing in workplace bias training. She recognized what was happening immediately. "This boarding pass looks different from our standard first-class issue," Vanessa continued, though Thomas knew this wasn't true. "How did you book this ticket, sir?" "Through the SkyDream app," Thomas answered, his voice remaining even. "Is there an actual issue with my ticket?" Greg stepped in, his voice lowered as if sharing a confidence. "Sir, first-class accommodations on this route are quite premium. Sometimes passengers are confused about their booking class. Economy comfort is often mistaken for first class." 2 rows behind Daniel Foster. 32, a tech executive heading to a conference in San Francisco, glanced up from his laptop. He'd been half listening to the exchange, but now he removed his earbuds, his brow furrowing slightly. "I'm not confused about my booking," Thomas said, his calm undisturbed. "I'm in the correct seat." At the front galley, Maria Gonzalez organized beverages for the in-flight service, but her movements had slowed. She kept her head down, but her eyes occasionally darted toward the interaction taking place in row 2. Something in her expression suggested discomfort. Sarah Anderson had abandoned all pretense of looking at her phone. She was now openly watching, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. When she caught Maria's eye, the younger woman quickly looked away. William Crawford leaned slightly toward the aisle. "Everything all right, Vanessa?" he asked, his tone suggesting he was offering assistance rather than simple curiosity. "Just a small seating confusion, Mr. Crawford. Nothing to worry about," Vanessa replied with a warmth that had been noticeably absent when addressing Thomas. "I assure you there's no confusion on my part," Thomas said, his voice still measured but with a new firmness around the edges. Sarah Anderson reached for her phone again, but this time she wasn't scrolling, she was activating the camera. The movement wasn't obvious, but Thomas noticed. So did Maria from her position at the galley. Greg Sullivan cleared his throat. "Sir, perhaps you'd be more comfortable in our economy plus section. It's quite spacious, and we'd be happy to assist with relocating your belongings." The suggestion hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but the weighted recognition of what was happening. He'd been here before in different settings, different contexts, but always the same underlying message. You don't belong here. Daniel Foster was now fully engaged in the scene unfolding. He glanced from Thomas to the flight attendants, then to Sarah Anderson, who had positioned her phone to capture the interaction. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of silent acknowledgement. "I'm perfectly comfortable right where I am," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "In the seat assigned to me." Vanessa's smile thinned. "Of course, sir. We just want to ensure all our passengers have the experience they paid for." The slight emphasis on the last 2 words was subtle but unmistakable. From the rear of the first-class cabin, another passenger had begun paying attention, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who had boarded late and been engrossed in his phone until now. James Wilson. 51, executive vice president at a major consulting firm, frowned slightly as he observed the exchange. "I'd like my boarding pass back, please," Thomas said, extending his hand. Vanessa hesitated for a fraction of a second before returning it. "Certainly, sir. I apologize for any inconvenience." The words were correct, but the tone suggested she was merely following protocol rather than offering a genuine apology. As Vanessa and Greg moved back toward the galley, they exchanged glances. Maria quickly busied herself with the beverage cart, avoiding eye contact with her colleagues. Sarah Anderson put down her phone and leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," she said quietly to Thomas. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Sarah." Thomas turned. "Thomas Bennett," he replied with a nod. "That was completely inappropriate," she said, keeping her voice low. "I work in HR. What just happened, that was textbook discriminatory behavior. Unfortunately, it's also textbook familiar," Thomas replied. Behind them, Daniel Foster had switched seats to be closer to their conversation. "Hey, I'm Dan," he said, leaning forward. "That was seriously not cool. Are you going to report them?" Before Thomas could answer, James Wilson joined the conversation from his seat. "I fly this route twice a month," he said. "I've never seen them verify anyone else's ticket like that." Thomas took in these three strangers, Sarah with her professional indignation, Daniel with his youthful outrage, James with his matter-of-fact assessment. For a moment he was touched by their solidarity, their recognition of what was happening. But before he could respond, Vanessa Thompson returned to his seat. This time with a different approach. "If you've ever witnessed something like this and weren't sure whether to speak up or stay silent, let me know in the comments what you did. And if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect regardless of how they look, make sure to give this video a thumbs up." "Sir, I apologize for the confusion," Vanessa said, her voice louder than necessary, clearly meant to be heard by surrounding passengers. "We've been experiencing issues with our ticketing system. For security purposes, could I see another form of identification and the credit card used for your purchase?" Thomas felt a familiar weight settle over him, the burden of having to prove himself of being presumed somehow fraudulent until proven legitimate. He'd known this feeling his entire career from the first job interview where the receptionist had directed him to the service entrance to the bank meetings, where he'd been mistaken for an assistant rather than the founder of a growing airline. "I've shown you my boarding pass," he said evenly. "Is it standard SkyDream policy to request additional identification and payment verification after passengers are already seated?" The question was pointed professional. Thomas was acutely aware of the eyes on him. Sarah and Daniel watching supportively, James observing with measured interest, William Crawford with barely disguised skepticism, Maria from her position near the galley with what looked like growing discomfort. "It's standard procedure when there are concerns about the validity of a boarding pass," Greg Sullivan interjected, stepping back into the conversation. "And what specific concerns do you have about my boarding pass?" Thomas asked. Vanessa hesitated. "Sir, we're simply trying to ensure that you're properly seated. First class on this route is quite exclusive, and you're wondering how someone who looks like me could afford it." Thomas finished for her, his voice still calm but edged with clarity. A hush fell over the front of the cabin. William Crawford suddenly became very interested in his newspaper. James Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's not—" "I never said." Vanessa stammered, color rising in her cheeks. "You didn't have to," Thomas replied. "Now either clearly state what policy I'm violating or please allow me to enjoy the flight I paid for." Greg Sullivan's face hardened. "Sir, there's no need to be confrontational. We're just doing our jobs." "And I'm just sitting in my assigned seat," Thomas countered. "Which part of that requires additional verification?" Sarah Anderson leaned forward again. "Excuse me," she said to Greg and Vanessa. "I'm curious. Are you asking all first-class passengers for secondary ID and payment verification today? Or is this a selective process? Greg shot her an irritated glance. Ma'am, please, this doesn't concern you. Actually, Daniel Foster chimed in, I think it concerns all of us when airline staff profiles passengers. Nobody is profiling anyone, Vanessa said sharply. This is a security matter. Really? Sarah pressed. Because I fly first class frequently, and I've never once been asked to prove I paid for my ticket after boarding. Thomas remained quiet, observing the dynamics unfold around him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a microcosm of a larger conversation playing out at 30,000 feet. Maria Gonzalez approached with the beverage cart, her discomfort evident. Excuse me, she said softly. Would anyone like a drink before meal service? I think we're still resolving a situation here, Maria Gregg said dismissively. Maria hesitated, then made a decision. Actually, she said, her voice gaining strength, I checked the manifest before boarding. All passengers are in their assigned seats. There's no ticketing issue. Greg turned to her, surprise and annoyance flashing across his face. Maria, please continue with beverage service. We'll handle this. Thomas watched Maria's momentary courage waver under Greg's authority. She nodded and began serving William Crawford, first avoiding eye contact with Thomas. If there's no ticketing issue, Thomas said calmly, then I'm not sure what we're still discussing. Vanessa straightened her posture. Sir, your attitude is becoming problematic. If you can't cooperate with a simple verification request. My attitude? Thomas raised an eyebrow. I've remained perfectly calm while being singled out for special scrutiny. I've asked clear questions about why I'm being treated differently from other passengers. How exactly is that problematic? William Crawford finally lowered his newspaper. Oh, for heaven's sake, he muttered loudly enough to be heard. Just show them your ID and be done with it. Some of us would like to have a peaceful flight. The comment hung in the air, its subtext clear. Just comply. Don't make a scene. Accept the indignity for everyone else's comfort. It was a sentiment Thomas had heard throughout his life in various forms from various sources. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Accept the small injustices to avoid larger confrontations. Actually, James Wilson spoke up from his seat. I'd like to know if this is standard SkyDream policy too. I've been a platinum member for 5 years and have never witnessed this kind of verification. Vanessa's professional demeanor was cracking slightly under the mounting pressure. Sir, she addressed Thomas again, if you just cooperate, we can resolve this quickly, and I have cooperated. Thomas interrupted gently. I showed you my boarding pass. I confirmed my seat assignment. I explained how I purchased my ticket. What I haven't done is accept the implication that my presence in first class is somehow suspicious or requires special validation. Sarah Anderson had her phone out again, no longer hiding that she was recording. I think this is an important moment, she said. This is exactly the kind of situation my company helps businesses avoid through proper training. Greg Sullivan noticed the phone. Ma'am, recording is not permitted. Actually, Daniel interjected, SkyDream's own policy only prohibits recording of crew members performing safety duties. This isn't a safety issue, is it? Unless you're suggesting that a passenger sitting quietly in his assigned seat poses some kind of threat. Thomas observed the shifting dynamics with the detached clarity that had served him well throughout his career. What had begun as a quiet attempt to make him doubt his place, or perhaps even voluntarily relocate to economy, had escalated into a public examination of assumptions and authority. This is ridiculous, Vanessa finally said. Sir, either show us additional ID and proof of payment, or we'll need to involve the captain. Thomas felt a moment of decision approaching a familiar crossroads he had faced many times before. He could take the path of least resistance, show his ID, maybe even his company credit card with T. Bennett, SkyDream Airlines embossed on it, end the confrontation. It would be easier, certainly, The flight would continue without disruption. But something deeper held him back, the memory of his mother staring out airport windows at planes she would never board. The weight of all the times he had swallowed indignities for the sake of peace. The core principle upon which he had built his airline. Respect was non-negotiable. Thomas closed his notebook and looked directly at Vanessa and Greg. "I think involving the captain is an excellent idea," he said quietly, "because we're about to have a much larger conversation about SkyDream's policies and practices." Neither Vanessa nor Greg recognized the calm determination in his voice, the same tone he had used 15 years earlier when bankers told him his airline would never succeed. The same tone he had used when industry veterans laughed at his emphasis on respect over profit margins. The tone of a man who had built an empire on the radical notion of equal worth. In fact, Thomas continued reaching for his phone. "I think it's time to involve more than just the captain." Vanessa and Greg exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly sensing that the situation was shifting beyond their control. They had no idea just how right they were. How would you react in Thomas's situation? Would you take the path of least resistance or stand your ground? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see what happens next. The cabin air felt charged as Thomas dialed a number from memory. Vanessa and Greg watched with growing uncertainty as he put the phone to his ear, their earlier confidence wavering. "Diane." "It's Thomas," he said into the phone, his voice level. "I'm on flight 218 to San Francisco. I need you to pull the customer service records for this flight immediately." He paused, listening. "Yes, all of them. And connect me to operations control in 5 minutes." Greg stepped forward, his composure slipping. "Sir, phone calls are not permitted until we reach cruising altitude." "I'm going to have to ask you to. This is a company phone," Thomas replied, covering the mouthpiece briefly. "And this is company business." The phrasing caught Greg off guard. He glanced at Vanessa, whose expression had shifted from righteous indignation to the first flickers of uncertainty. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but," she began. "That's becoming increasingly clear," Thomas replied, then returned to his call. "Diane, I also need you to contact legal and PR. We may have a situation developing." Another pause. "No, I'm fine, but I think we have a fundamental issue that needs addressing." William Crawford was now fully engaged in the unfolding drama, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by growing curiosity. Sarah Anderson continued recording discreetly while Daniel Foster watched with undisguised fascination. Maria had stopped her beverage service, entirely frozen in place near the galley. Thomas ended his call and looked up at Greg and Vanessa, who remained standing in the aisle. "The captain will be receiving a call from operations in approximately 2 minutes. I suggest you prepare to explain why you felt it necessary to publicly question the validity of a first-class passenger's ticket based on," he paused, "whatever criteria you were using." Something in his calm confidence finally penetrated their certainty. Greg's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. Thomas considered the question. Throughout his life, he'd been asked that same question in various forms, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, whenever he occupied spaces others felt he didn't belong in. The assumption that he must be someone special to justify his presence, that his mere humanity wasn't enough. "I'm a passenger in seat 2A, he answered simply. "That should be sufficient." Before Greg could respond, a call came through on the cabin phone. Vanessa moved to answer it, her face paling slightly as she listened. She covered the mouthpiece and whispered something urgent to Greg, whose eyes widened. "Mr. Bennett," Vanessa said, her tone dramatically transformed. "The captain would like to speak with you. If you'd come with me to the cockpit." "That won't be necessary," Thomas replied. "Please tell Captain Reynolds that I'll speak with him after I finish addressing the situation in the cabin." The power dynamic had shifted so abruptly that several passengers exchanged confused glances. William Crawford leaned forward in his seat, eyes narrowed in reassessment. James Wilson's expression had transformed from mild interest to intense focus. "Mr. Bennett Gregg said the confrontational edge gone from his voice if we've made some kind of mistake." The mistake, Thomas interrupted quietly, was assuming that someone who looks like me couldn't possibly belong in first class unless they somehow proved otherwise. The mistake was creating different standards for different passengers based on appearance. The mistake was forgetting the core principle of this airline. Sarah Anderson had lowered her phone, but her attention remained fixed on the unfolding scene. "May I ask who you are?" she inquired. Thomas turned to her. "My name is Thomas Bennett," he said. "I founded SkyDream Airlines 15 years ago." A ripple of reaction moved through the cabin. William Crawford's jaw actually dropped. Maria Gonzalez took an involuntary step backward, nearly colliding with the beverage cart. Daniel Foster let out a low whistle. "You're the CEO?" Vanessa's voice had risen an octave, her face draining of color. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "And while I'm extremely disappointed by what I've witnessed today, this isn't about my position. This would be equally unacceptable if I were any other passenger." Gregg had gone very still, the implications of the situation clearly dawning on him. "Sir, Mr. Bennett, I assure you we had no idea." "That's precisely the point," Thomas cut in. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with basic respect. That's the foundation this airline was built on." The cabin phone rang again. This time Gregg answered it, his "Yes, Captain" audible to everyone nearby. He listened, nodded, then extended the handset to Thomas. "Captain Reynolds would like to speak with you, sir." Thomas took the phone. "Jim, yes, I'm fine." He listened for a moment. "No, don't turn back. Continue to San Francisco. But I need you to be aware that I'm implementing Protocol 0 effective immediately." Another pause. "Yes, company-wide. I'll handle the ground logistics from here. Just focus on flying the plane." He handed the phone back to Gregg, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. "Protocol 0. He repeated the words, barely a whisper. Thomas nodded once. "Protocol 0. The gravity in his voice conveyed that something momentous had been set in motion, though only Gregg seemed to understand exactly what it meant. William Crawford could no longer contain himself. "Excuse me," he interjected. "But what exactly is Protocol 0? Thomas turned to face the other passengers, his expression solemn but resolute. Protocol 0 is an emergency procedure that temporarily halts all SkyDream operations for institutional reset. As of this moment, no new SkyDream flights will depart until further notice. Planes currently in the air, including ours, will continue to their destinations. But the entire SkyDream network is essentially grounded." A collective gasp moved through the cabin. Even Sarah Anderson, who had been firmly on Thomas's side, looked shocked. "You're shutting down an entire airline because of this?" William Crawford asked incredulously. "No, Mr. Crawford," Thomas replied. "I'm temporarily halting operations because what happened here isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger failure, one that directly contradicts everything this company stands for." He turned back to Gregg and Vanessa, who stood frozen in horrified realization. This isn't about punishing individuals. It's about acknowledging that somewhere between our founding principles and today, something fundamental was lost. And I refuse to operate an airline that doesn't live up to its promise of equal respect for every passenger. The cabin fell silent as the magnitude of Thomas's decision sank in. Thousands of flights, tens of thousands of passengers, an entire corporate ecosystem, all paused because of what had transpired in these few cubic feet of cabin space. Sir Maria Gonzalez stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "I want you to know that not all of us, I mean, I noticed what was happening and I tried to. She stopped, seeming to realize that her small intervention had been too little too late. Thomas nodded to her, his expression softening slightly. I know, Maria. And that's why I believe we can fix this. But first, we need to acknowledge that there's something broken. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. He checked it quickly. Operations Control has confirmed Protocol 0 implementation. All departures are now on hold. Greg looked physically ill. Mr. Bennett, please, my career is not my primary concern right now. Thomas finished for him. My concern is ensuring that no other passenger experiences what I just did. My concern is making sure that SkyDream actually lives up to its name and its promise. Daniel Foster leaned forward. So what happens next? To the flights to these guys? He gestured toward Greg and Vanessa. Thomas considered the question. Throughout his career, he'd learned that the most powerful moments weren't about punishment or revenge. They were about transformation. Next, he said, we rebuild, starting right here, right now, in this cabin, before we dive deeper into what happens next. Comment below with your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? And if you believe that respect should be non-negotiable, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. The next few minutes will reveal how one man's principled stand transformed an entire industry. For a long moment, the cabin remained suspended in shocked silence. The mundane sounds of air travel, the steady hum of engines, the faint chime of a call button from economy seemed to belong to another world entirely. In this space, time had compressed around the gravity of Thomas Bennett's decision. Vanessa Thompson was the first to break the silence, her professional composure cracking under the weight of realization. Mr. Bennett, I can only imagine how this must have felt, but grounding the entire airline, surely that's an overreaction. We made a mistake. A terrible mistake, but this isn't about a mistake, Thomas interrupted gently. A mistake is serving the wrong drink or misplacing a bag. What happened here was the manifestation of something deeper, a fundamental drift from our core values. His phone buzzed again with incoming messages. Operations confirming the halt of departures. Marketing requesting guidance on public statements. His executive assistant coordinating an emergency board meeting. The machinery of corporate crisis management was already in motion. Thomas set the phone aside. 5 years ago, he continued looking not just at Vanessa and Greg, but at all the passengers listening intently. I would have been personally served by the lead flight attendant, who would have known exactly who I was, because we were a smaller operation then. 3 years ago, I might have been recognized by half the crew. Today, I boarded anonymously, as I often do, to experience SkyDream as our customers do. He paused, his gaze level. What I discovered is that somewhere along the way, as we grew and hired thousands of new employees, as we added routes and aircraft, we lost something essential. The promise I made when founding this airline that every passenger would be treated with equal respect, regardless of appearance or background, is no longer being kept. Greg Sullivan had moved back slightly, as if physical distance might somehow insulate him from the situation. Sir, I assure you we receive extensive training on customer service and yet, Thomas cut in when faced with a passenger who didn't fit your mental image of first class. Your instinct wasn't service, but suspicion. That tells me our training has become a script rather than a value system. Sarah Anderson nodded in recognition. Classic implementation gap, she said. Organizations often have the right policies on paper, but the lived experience reveals the true culture. Thomas acknowledged her insight with a nod. Exactly. And culture isn't changed through memos or reprimands. It requires something more fundamental. His phone rang again, his CFO this time undoubtedly calculating the financial impact of Protocol 0. Thomas declined the call. There would be time for those conversations later. Sir, it was Maria Gonzalez, her voice steadier now. May I ask what happens to the crew? To all of us. The question hung in the air, layered with implications. Thomas recognized the fear behind it, not just for individual jobs, but for livelihoods, for stability, for futures suddenly thrown into uncertainty by his decision. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility press down on him. Thousands of employees, from pilots to ground crew to office staff, would be affected by Protocol Zero. Passengers with critical connections, important meetings, family events, all would face disruption. The financial cost would run into millions. The media storm would be intense. For a brief human moment, Thomas questioned himself. Was this too extreme? Was he overreacting to a personal slight? Could there be a more proportionate response that would address the issue without such widespread consequences? He closed his eyes briefly, and in that darkness saw his mother's face, her quiet dignity as she mopped floors, walked upon by people who never truly saw her. He remembered her words, "Just once, I want to fly." When he opened his eyes, his resolve had crystallized. "This isn't about punishment, Maria," he said. "This is about renewal. Every SkyDream employee will participate in a comprehensive recommitment to our founding principles. Some may choose to leave, that's their right. But those who stay will help rebuild something remarkable." William Crawford scoffed. "With all due respect, Mr. Bennett, you're talking about paralyzing an entire airline because 2 employees were rude to you. As a frequent business traveler, I have to say that seems wildly disproportionate." "It may seem that way from your perspective," Mr. Crawford Thomas replied evenly. "But then you've never had your belonging questioned simply because of how you look. You've never had to prove you deserve a seat you've already paid for." Crawford's face reddened slightly. "That's not... I understand it was inappropriate, but you were recognized by name when you boarded," Thomas pointed out. "Your drink preference was remembered. You were treated as valued and welcome while I was treated as suspect. That's not just inappropriate, it's a betrayal of what this airline stands for." James Wilson leaned forward. "I fly dozens of airlines for business. Mr. Bennett and I have to say what you're describing as SkyDream's founding principle isn't the industry standard. Most airlines have tiered service by design. First class gets better treatment, economy less so. SkyDream was never meant to be standard," Thomas replied, a hint of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. "We built different service tiers. Yes, better seats, better food, more space for higher fares. But the one thing that was meant to be consistent across every cabin was basic human respect. A passenger in the last row of economy deserves the same recognition of their worth as someone in 1A. He paused, running a hand across his face. At least that was the vision. Now I'm not sure what we've become. Daniel Foster nodded enthusiastically. That's why I started flying SkyDream exclusively last year. The difference was noticeable, or it was until recently. Thomas's phone vibrated again with a text from his Executive VP of Operations, Protocol Zero fully implemented. All departures halted. 247 aircraft, currently airborne, will continue to destinations. Contingency plans activated for stranded passengers. The scale of what he had set in motion hit Thomas with renewed force. Protocol Zero had been established years ago as a theoretical emergency measure, a complete operational pause that could be triggered only by the CEO in extreme circumstances. It had never been implemented, had existed only as a worst-case scenario in crisis management documents. Until today. Vanessa, who had been silent for several minutes, suddenly spoke. "Mr. Bennett, Her voice caught. "I want you to know that I never intended..." She stopped again, seeming to realize that intentions weren't the point. Thomas regarded her thoughtfully. "Vanessa, do you know why I created SkyDream?" She shook her head mutely. "My mother cleaned floors at JFK for 22 years, he said. She watched thousands of planes take off, but never boarded one herself. Not because she didn't want to fly, but because the experience wasn't designed for people like her. It wasn't accessible. It wasn't welcoming. It wasn't respectful. The cabin had gone completely silent, every passenger intent on his words. When I founded this airline, I made a promise that we would be different, that every person who boarded our planes would be treated with the same level of basic respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or ticket class. That promise is carved into the cornerstone of our headquarters. It's printed on the first page of our employee handbook. It's the reason many of our passengers choose us over our competitors. Thomas's voice remained steady, but the emotion behind his words was palpable. Today, that promise was broken. Not just to me, but to every passenger who has ever felt unwelcome or unworthy because of who they are rather than how they behave. And I will not allow SkyDream to continue operating until we have recommitted to that founding principle. Greg Sullivan, who had remained frozen in horrified realization, finally spoke. "What can we do?" he asked quietly. "How do we make this right?" Thomas regarded him steadily. "That," he said, "is the first step, acknowledging that something needs to be made right. The next step is harder, and it starts with honest reflection." As Thomas prepared to continue, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. I've just received confirmation that we'll be continuing to San Francisco as scheduled. However, I want to inform you that SkyDream has implemented a temporary operational pause. This will not affect our flight, but it does mean there will be no further SkyDream departures today. We'll provide more information as it becomes available." A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers processed this announcement. Thomas felt the gravity of the moment pressing down on him, a decision made in principle that would have real-world consequences for thousands. Yet even as the magnitude of those consequences registered, he felt an odd sense of peace. After years of building an airline centered on respect, he had been faced with a moment that tested his commitment to that principle, and he had chosen to stand firm. His phone buzzed again, the board chair this time. That was a call he would have to take eventually. But for now, Thomas Bennett remained focused on the microcosm within this aircraft cabin where a small moment of discrimination had catalyzed something much larger. The real work was just beginning. Do you think Thomas made the right call with Protocol 0 too extreme, or exactly what was needed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the next part of this incredible story. Mr. Bennett. Vanessa began, her voice steadier. "Now, I want to apologize sincerely for how I treated you. There's no excuse, and You're right," Thomas interrupted gently. "There isn't an excuse. But there is a context and understanding that context is crucial if we're going to address the real issue." He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood turning to face the first-class cabin. Every eye was upon him. Passengers, flight attendants, even a few curious faces peering from economy through the dividing curtain. In that moment, Thomas was acutely aware that he was no longer just a passenger in seat 2A, or even the CEO of SkyDream. He had become the focal point of a larger conversation about worth belonging and institutional values. For those who don't know me, he began, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. "My name is Thomas Bennett. 15 years ago, I founded SkyDream Airlines with a simple but radical premise that air travel should be accessible and respectful for everyone, regardless of their background or appearance." He paused, noting the mix of expressions around him: curiosity, surprise, and in some cases, dawning recognition. "I didn't come from the airline industry's upper echelons. I grew up watching my mother clean the floors of this very airport, dreaming of a day when she might board one of the planes she helped maintain. She never got that chance." Thomas moved into the aisle, his presence commanding but not intimidating. "Today, I boarded this flight as I occasionally do anonymously to experience SkyDream as our customers do. What I discovered was deeply troubling. When I wasn't recognized as the CEO, when I was just another passenger who happened to be black, I was treated as if I didn't belong in first class. I was questioned, scrutinized, and made to feel unwelcome in the very airline I created. Vanessa and Greg stood with downcast eyes, the public nature of this revelation clearly uncomfortable for them. Thomas didn't take satisfaction in their discomfort, but he recognized the necessary discomfort of truth-telling. "This isn't about public shaming," he continued. "It's about acknowledging a reality that many passengers face daily, not just on SkyDream, but across the travel industry. It's about recognizing that despite our best intentions, despite our written policies and training programs, we have failed to truly embed our core value of equal respect into our organizational culture." Sarah Anderson nodded in recognition. As someone who works in corporate diversity and inclusion, she said, "I see this pattern frequently. Organizations often have the right language in their mission statements, but struggle to translate that into consistent lived experience for customers and employees." "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "And that gap between what we say we believe and how we actually behave is what Protocol Zero is designed to address." Daniel Foster raised his hand like a student in class. "So what exactly does Protocol Zero mean for everyone? Like practically speaking?" Thomas appreciated the question's directness. "Practically speaking, it means every SkyDream flight currently at a gate is staying there. Planes in the air, including ours, will continue to their destinations. All passengers affected by cancellations will be rebooked on partner airlines or provided hotel accommodations." He checked his phone briefly before continuing. "For our employees, it means a complete operational pause while we undertake a comprehensive recommitment to our founding principles. This isn't just about additional training, it's about rebuilding our culture from the ground up." William Crawford, who had been uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke. "Mr. Bennett, while I understand your disappointment, don't you think this response is extreme? The financial impact alone must be staggering." "It is," Thomas acknowledged. "Our CFO has already informed me that Protocol Zero will cost approximately $12 million per day in direct operational losses, not counting the potential long-term impact on customer loyalty and brand reputation." Crawford's eyebrows rose at the figure. "And you're willing to absorb that kind of loss over this incident?" "This incident, as you call it, is merely a symptom of a deeper issue," Thomas replied. "And yes, I am willing to absorb that cost, because the alternative, continuing to operate an airline that has drifted from its founding values, would ultimately be more costly not just financially but morally." James Wilson leaned forward in his seat. "I've been in business for 30 years, Mr. Bennett, and I've never seen a CEO take such a dramatic stand on a matter of principle. It's unexpectedly refreshing." Thomas smiled slightly. "My board of directors may have a different perspective when we meet tomorrow. But leadership isn't just about quarterly results. It's about standing firm on the values that give an organization its purpose." Maria Gonzalez, who had remained near the galley, finally spoke up. "Mr. Bennett, may I ask something?" "Of course, Maria. What happens to the employees who were involved in situations like this?" Her eyes flicked briefly toward Vanessa and Greg before returning to Thomas. It was the question hanging unspoken in the air: what consequences would there be for the flight attendants who had questioned Thomas's belonging in first class? The traditional corporate response would be swift termination, a public statement about zero tolerance, perhaps even using Vanessa and Greg as scapegoats to demonstrate the company's commitment to its values. Thomas considered Maria's question carefully. Throughout his career, he had seen how organizations often addressed symptoms rather than causes, how they sacrificed individuals to protect institutions, how they confused punishment with accountability. "That's an important question," he said finally. "And the answer might surprise you. Vanessa and Greg aren't being fired." A ripple of reaction moved through the cabin. Vanessa's head snapped up in disbelief while Greg's expression transformed from resignation to confusion. Instead, Thomas continued, They'll be at the center of our rebuilding process. Because this isn't about removing a few bad apples and pretending the orchard is healthy. It's about examining the soil in which those apples grew. He turned directly to Vanessa and Greg. You'll work directly with our newly formed culture renewal team, sharing your unfiltered perspective on how and why today's events unfolded. You'll help us understand the gap between our stated values and our lived practices. And if you're willing to engage in that process with honesty and commitment, you'll help shape the sky dream of tomorrow. Vanessa's eyes had filled with tears. I don't understand, she managed. Why would you want me to stay after what I did? Because firing you would be easy, Thomas replied simply. It would allow everyone to believe that the problem has been solved, that it was just a matter of individual behavior rather than institutional culture. And that would be a comfortable fiction. He addressed the entire cabin again. The uncomfortable truth is that Vanessa and Greg aren't outliers. They're symptoms of a culture that has drifted from its moorings. And fixing that requires not exclusion, but inclusion, not punishment, but transformation. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We're beginning our initial descent into San Francisco. At this time, we ask that all passengers return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Thomas nodded acknowledgement and returned to his seat, buckling himself in. The revelation of his identity and the implementation of Protocol Zero had transformed the atmosphere in the cabin. Passengers who had been strangers an hour ago were now engaged in thoughtful conversation about what they had witnessed. Sarah Anderson was deep in discussion with James Wilson about corporate culture change. Daniel Foster was explaining the significance of Thomas's decision to another passenger. As the plane began its descent, Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from his executive VP of Communications Media getting wind of Protocol Zero, requesting statement. How do you want to frame this? Thomas replied simply, truthfully. The mountains surrounding the Bay Area came into view outside his window. 15 years ago, he had flown this same route on SkyDream's inaugural flight filled with hope and determination to build an airline unlike any other. An airline where his mother would have felt welcome and respected had she lived to see it. Today, he had taken dramatic action to ensure that vision didn't fade into corporate rhetoric. The cost would be high financially, reputationally, perhaps even personally. The board might question his judgment. Shareholders might demand his resignation. Industry analysts would certainly criticize the decision as excessive and emotionally driven. But as the plane descended toward San Francisco International Airport, Thomas Bennett felt the rightness of his choice settle over him like a mantle. Some principles were worth the cost of upholding them. Some promises needed to be kept, especially when keeping them was difficult. Equal respect was non-negotiable. That had been true when he founded SkyDream, and it remained true today. Whatever came next, Thomas knew he had honored that core truth. The wheels touched down on California soil, and a new chapter in SkyDream's story began. Have you ever had to make a tough decision to stand up for what you believe in? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonates with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more powerful stories of principle in action. The seatbelt sign dinged off. The cabin filled with the familiar sounds of arrival, overhead bins, opening phones, powering on the rustle of belongings being gathered. But underneath these ordinary noises ran a current of something extraordinary, intense conversation. Furtive glances toward Thomas, the hum of a story taking shape in real time. Thomas remained seated, responding to the barrage of messages and calls that had accumulated during the flight's final descent. His executive team needed guidance. The board demanded answers. The press wanted statements. But before addressing any of that, Thomas had one priority. Captain Reynolds is requesting to speak with you, Greg Sullivan said, approaching Thomas's seat with noticeably different body language than earlier, respectful rather than confrontational. Perhaps even a touch deferential. He's waiting by the cockpit door. Thomas nodded, gathering his notebook and phone. As he stood, passengers throughout the cabin watched with undisguised interest. Some nodded in respect. Others seemed unsure how to react to the CEO who had just grounded his own airline. James Wilson extended his hand as Thomas passed. "Bold move, Mr. Bennett. If you need allies in the corporate world during the fallout, my firm stands ready." "Thank you," Thomas replied, shaking his hand. "I suspect we'll need all the allies we can get." Sarah Anderson was already on her phone. "My team specializes in institutional culture renovation," she said, passing Thomas her business card. "We'd be honored to contribute to SkyDream's renewal process." Thomas accepted the card with a grateful nod. Even William Crawford, who had been skeptical of Thomas's decision, gave a grudging nod of acknowledgement as he passed. At the front of the cabin, Captain Jim Reynolds waited a veteran pilot who had been with SkyDream almost from the beginning. His weathered face showed concern mixed with respect. "Thomas," he said quietly, using the familiar address of a longtime colleague rather than the formal Mr. Bennett others had adopted. "Headquarters is in chaos. The board is convening an emergency session. Are you sure about this?" Thomas clasped the pilot's shoulder. "More sure than I've been about anything since founding the airline, Jim. It's time to reset." Reynolds nodded slowly. "You know I'm with you. Most of the old guard will be. It's just—" He hesitated. "Protocol Zero was designed for extreme situations. Security breaches, safety failures. This is a failure of our core mission," Thomas replied firmly. "That's extreme enough." The captain seemed to accept this. "What's the next step?" "I'm convening the executive leadership team at SFO's conference center in 30 minutes. I need you there. The flight crews respect you, and we'll need that influence in the days ahead. I'll be there," Reynolds promised. "And Thomas, for what it's worth, your mother would be proud." The simple statement, delivered without sentimentality but with genuine feeling, caught Thomas off guard. A brief but powerful wave of emotion washed over him. Pride, grief, determination, all mingled together. He nodded once, unable to trust his voice for a moment. As Thomas made his way off the aircraft, he found Maria Gonzalez waiting near the exit door. "Mr. Bennett," she said quietly, "I wanted to say I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner when I saw what was happening." "You did speak up eventually," Maria Thomas replied. "That matters. Will the company be okay?" The question held layers of concern for her job, certainly, but also for the airline itself, the community it represented. "We'll be better than okay," Thomas assured her. "We'll be authentic again." He stepped into the jet bridge where his executive VP of operations, Hector Ramirez, waited with a tablet showing real-time updates on Protocol Zero implementation. 247 aircraft safely grounded at 63 airports, Hector reported without preamble. "Partner airlines are accommodating our stranded passengers. Hotel arrangements confirmed for those who can't be rebooked today. Social media is exploding with speculation about why we've halted operations." Thomas nodded, processing the information as they walked briskly through the terminal. And the team assembled at the conference center as requested. Laura is having palpitations about the financial implications. Jennifer is fielding press inquiries but holding firm on no comment until you provide direction. They pushed through a side door, avoiding the main terminal where passengers and press might recognize Thomas. A company car waited to transport them to the airport's executive conference facility. The board chair called 3 times. Hector continued as they settled into the back seat. "She's not pleased." Thomas had expected as much. Eleanor Wright had been a steadfast ally in building SkyDream, but her focus had always been financial performance rather than cultural integrity. She would see Protocol Zero as a dangerously disproportionate response. "I'll speak with her after the executive meeting," Thomas said. "First, we need to align the leadership team." The car pulled up to the conference center's private entrance. Thomas took a deep breath, centering himself for what would undoubtedly be a challenging meeting. The decisions made in the next few hours would shape SkyDream's future institutionally, culturally, and financially. Inside, the executive leadership team waited around a large table, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern to outright alarm. Laura Blackwell, the CFO, was furiously working on her laptop, likely calculating the financial damage. Jennifer Tate, head of PR, was fielding non-stop calls, her normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Hector took his seat at the table, leaving the head chair for Thomas. The room fell silent as Thomas entered. These were his trusted colleagues, the men and women who had helped build SkyDream into a major carrier. They were smart, dedicated professionals, and they were clearly bewildered by the sudden implementation of Protocol Zero. "Thank you all for assembling so quickly." Thomas began taking his place at the head of the table. "I know you have questions. I know headquarters is in chaos. I know the board is demanding explanations. But before we address any of that, I need to tell you what happened on Flight 218 today and why it necessitated such a dramatic response." For the next 15 minutes, Thomas recounted the events in first class, the subtle and then overt questioning of his belonging, the assumptions made about his ability to afford the seat, the clear disparity in how he was treated compared to other passengers. He detailed not just the actions, but the underlying attitudes they revealed. "This isn't about two flight attendants making poor judgments," he concluded. "It's about a culture that has drifted so far from our founding principles that those judgments seemed appropriate to them. It's about the gap between what we say we value and what we actually practice." Thomas Bennett. Eleanor Wright's voice sliced through the room as she burst through the door, her face flushed with anger. "Have you lost your mind? The board is in an uproar. Protocol Zero over a customer service incident. This is corporate suicide." The room fell silent as Eleanor stormed to the table. As board chair, she rarely attended executive meetings unless specifically invited, but the implementation of Protocol Zero had clearly shattered normal protocols. Eleanor Thomas acknowledged calmly, "I was planning to join the board call after aligning the executive team. The time for alignment was before you grounded an entire airline, not after she snapped. We're bleeding millions by the hour. Our stock is plummeting in after-hours trading. Shareholders are calling for blood, your blood specifically." Thomas maintained his composure. "I understand the financial implications." "Do you?" Eleanor interrupted. "Because from where I'm standing, you've just risked 15 years of work, thousands of jobs, and billions in shareholder value because 2 employees didn't recognize you. That's not what happened. And you know it," Thomas replied, his voice firm but not raised. "What happened today was emblematic of a cultural drift that undermines everything SkyDream stands for." "Save the poetic language for the press," Eleanor shot back. "We're talking about millions in losses, potential shareholder lawsuits, massive disruption to operations, all because someone was rude to you." Laura Blackwell, who had been silent until now, spoke up. The preliminary financials support Eleanor's concern. "Thomas, we're looking at $12 million per day in direct losses. If this extends to the full 72-hour cultural renewal timeline you've proposed, that's $36 million, not counting brand damage and lost future bookings." Thomas felt the weight of those numbers. The practical consequences of his principled stand were becoming painfully concrete. For a moment, doubt flickered across his face. Jennifer Tate, who had been monitoring media responses, looked up from her tablet. "It's not all negative, though. The social media response is surprisingly mixed. Yes, many are angry about disrupted travel, but there's also significant support for a CEO who actually stands for something. The hashtag respect in the sky is trending." Eleanor dismissed this with a wave. Twitter approval doesn't pay the bills or satisfy shareholders. No, Thomas agreed, but it does indicate that our core values still resonate with the public, and those values are what built this airline in the first place. Hector Ramirez, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. I've been with SkyDream for 12 years, Eleanor. I was there when we had just 5 planes and a vision. Thomas is right, we've drifted. I see it in our operational metrics, in our customer feedback, in our employee satisfaction surveys. Something fundamental has changed. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Hector was respected for his data-driven approach and clear-eyed assessments. If he saw a problem, it wasn't easily dismissed. Even if that's true, she said Protocol Zero is a nuclear option. There were more measured responses available, like what Thomas challenged. Firing the flight attendants, issuing a corporate apology, adding another training module. Those are band-aids on a cultural hemorrhage. The tension in the room was palpable as executives and board chair faced off. The future of SkyDream hung in the balance, not just its financial health, but its very identity and purpose. Captain Reynolds, who had been standing quietly by the door since arriving, finally spoke. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority earned through thousands of flight hours, "I've been flying for 37 years. I've seen airlines come and go. The ones that survive aren't just the most profitable. They're the ones with a clear sense of who they are and what they stand for." All eyes turned to the veteran pilot. "What happened today on Flight 218 wasn't an isolated incident," he continued. "Every pilot, every flight attendant, every gate agent has seen the subtle shift in how we operate. We've become more efficient, certainly, more competitive perhaps, but we've lost something essential along the way." Eleanor's resistance visibly wavered. "Even if I accept that premise," she said, "why not implement changes gradually? Why bring everything to a halt?" "Because gradual change allows for gradual resistance," Thomas replied. "Protocol Zero creates a clean break, a moment to stop, reflect, and reset. Yes, it's costly. Yes, it's disruptive. But continuing on our current path would ultimately cost us far more." For several seconds, no one spoke. The weight of the decision, already implemented but still being processed, filled the room. Finally, Eleanor sighed heavily. "The board will need to be thoroughly convinced. I'm calling an emergency session for tomorrow morning. You'll need to make your case directly, Thomas. And it had better be compelling." "It will be," he promised. As Eleanor departed to prepare the board, the executive team began the complex work of managing the Protocol Zero implementation. The technical challenges were enormous, rerouting passengers, coordinating with partner airlines, handling press inquiries, preparing communications for employees across the globe. Throughout the flurry of activity, Thomas felt both the weight of his decision and the conviction that it had been necessary. The path ahead would be difficult, the criticism intense, the financial pain real. But as he watched his team mobilize around the renewal of SkyDream's core values, he knew that this moment of crisis also contained the seeds of transformation. His phone buzzed with a notification the first news stories about Protocol Zero were appearing online. The headlines ranged from critical SkyDream CEO halts operations in unprecedented overreaction to intrigued bold moral stand or corporate harakiri. SkyDream's Protocol Zero explained. The public narrative was forming, but Thomas knew the true story wasn't about him or even about what had happened on Flight 218. It was about an organization rediscovering its soul and the difficult, necessary journey back to its founding promise. Whatever came next, Thomas Bennett was committed to that journey. The cost was high, but the principles at stake were priceless. Have you ever witnessed a leader take a stand that put principle above profit? Share your stories in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for the next part of Thomas Bennett's journey to transform not just an airline, but an entire industry's understanding of what true respect means. The SFO conference room had transformed into a command center. Screens displayed real-time updates from across the SkyDream network. Planes safely landed, passengers rebooked, crews briefed. In the center of this controlled chaos, Thomas Bennett prepared to address not just his executive team, but the company's 42,000 employees worldwide. "We're live in 60 seconds. Jennifer Tate announced, checking the video setup one final time. Streaming to all SkyDream facilities, crew lounges, and employee devices. Estimated viewership, 35,000. Thomas nodded, straightening his tie, a small automatic gesture that belied the gravity of the moment. Around him, the executive team had taken their positions, a visual representation of solidarity despite the unprecedented circumstances. Thomas Laura Blackwell said, quietly stepping close. The stock has already dropped 8% in after-hours trading. Tomorrow will be worse. I know, Laura, he replied. We'll weather it. 30 seconds, Jennifer called. Thomas took a deep breath, centering himself. In the 15 years since founding SkyDream, he had addressed employees countless times, celebrations, challenges, strategic pivots. But never like this. Never after grounding the entire fleet. Live in 543? Jennifer counted down silently for the last 2 beats, then pointed to Thomas as the red recording light illuminated. Good evening, Thomas began, his voice steady and clear. By now, you've all heard that SkyDream has implemented Protocol 0, a complete operational pause across our entire network. Many of you are wondering why. All of you deserve to know the truth. For the next 10 minutes, Thomas recounted what had happened on Flight 218, not as the CEO who had been disrespected, but as a passenger whose worth had been compromised. He described the incident without embellishment, focusing not on individual blame, but on the underlying implications. What happened today wasn't just about me, he emphasized. It was about a fundamental disconnect between who we say we are and how we actually operate. It was about the gap between our stated values and our lived practices, and it requires not just acknowledgement, but action. Thomas outlined the cultural renewal initiative that the executive team had developed over the previous hours, a comprehensive plan to realign every aspect of SkyDream's operations with its founding principle of equal respect for all. This isn't about additional training sessions or new policy documents, he clarified. This is about rebuilding our organizational culture from the ground up. It's about ensuring that the promise of equal respect isn't just a marketing slogan, but a lived reality for every passenger on every flight. He addressed the practical concerns directly. Operations will resume gradually over the next 72 hours as teams complete their initial cultural recommitment workshops. No employee will lose pay during this pause. And no, we are not conducting mass terminations. This isn't about finding people to blame. It's about creating a system where our values thrive. As Thomas continued, he could see messages flowing in through the company's internal communication platform, questions, concerns, expressions of support. The employee response was just beginning. I know this decision comes at a significant cost, he acknowledged. Financial analysts will criticize it as excessive. Competitors will try to capitalize on the disruption. Some passengers will be inconvenienced despite our best efforts to accommodate them. Thomas paused, his expression resolute. But I founded SkyDream on the belief that equal respect is non-negotiable. That principle is worth defending, even especially when it's difficult. I'm asking each of you to join me in recommitting to that founding vision, to help rebuild SkyDream into the airline we have always aspired to be. As he concluded his address, Thomas could see the executive team watching with expressions ranging from concern to determination. They understood the magnitude of what had been set in motion. Thank you for your attention, Thomas finished. Specific instructions will be distributed to each team within the hour. Together, we will emerge from this pause stronger, more aligned, and more authentic than ever before. The red light blinked off. For a moment, silence filled the conference room. Then, Laura spoke first. Well, there's no turning back now. There never was. Thomas replied simply. The response from employees began pouring in immediately, thousands of messages flooding the company's internal platforms. As the communications team categorized and analyzed the feedback patterns emerged, The veteran employees, those who had been with SkyDream since its early days, expressed overwhelming support. They remembered the founding vision, recognized the drift that had occurred, and welcomed the recommitment. Newer employees showed more uncertainty, having joined a company already in transition from scrappy upstart to established carrier. For them, Protocol Zero represented a disruption without clear context. Middle management expressed the most concern, caught between strategic alignment and operational pressures. They would be responsible for implementing the Cultural Renewal Initiative while managing anxious teams and performance metrics. Frontline staff, flight attendants, gate agents, customer service representatives seemed divided, though a majority expressed relief that long-standing issues were finally being addressed. As the executive team processed this feedback, developing response strategies for each employee segment, Thomas's attention was drawn to a message from Captain Reynolds' flight crews are gathering in crew lounges worldwide. They're asking for direct dialogue. Ready when you are. Thomas nodded to Jennifer. Set up a video conference with representatives from flight crews at our top 10 hubs. I want to hear directly from them. Within 20 minutes, the conference room screen displayed faces from across the SkyDream network, senior flight attendants, and pilots from New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and beyond. Their expressions ranged from concern to curiosity. Thank you for joining on such short notice, Thomas began. Rather than me talking at you, I'd prefer to hear your thoughts and answer your questions directly. A senior flight attendant from Chicago spoke first. Mr. Bennett, I've been with SkyDream for 12 years. What happened on your flight today, it's not isolated. We've been seeing a shift in how certain passengers are treated, especially in premium cabins. It's subtle, but it's real. A pilot from Los Angeles nodded agreement. The culture has changed as we've grown. When I joined 8 years ago, there was a clear sense of mission beyond the bottom line. That's become diluted. As more crew members shared their perspectives, a clearer picture emerged, one of an organization that had expanded rapidly without fully transferring its founding values to new generations of employees. Training had become more procedural and less philosophical. Metrics focused on efficiency rather than equal respect. The very success that SkyDream had achieved threatened to undermine the principles that had made that success possible. This is exactly why Protocol Zero was necessary, Thomas said when the initial wave of feedback subsided. What we're hearing isn't about a few problematic individuals, it's about institutional drift. And correcting that requires a pause, a reset, a collective recommitment. A flight attendant from Miami raised her hand. Sir, we've all received the notification about the Cultural Renewal Workshop starting tomorrow. But what happens to Vanessa and Greg from today's flight? The rumor mill is already spinning. It was the question Thomas had anticipated, the natural human desire to locate blame in individuals rather than systems. He chose his words carefully. Vanessa and Greg will be participating in the renewal process like everyone else, he explained. They've agreed to share their perspective on today's events not as scapegoats, but as witnesses to a cultural breakdown. This isn't about punishment. It's about learning and growth. The response seemed to surprise many of the crew representatives. In an industry known for swift terminations after public incidents, this approach was unconventional. Some of you may disagree with that decision, Thomas acknowledged. You might feel it sends the wrong message about accountability. But true accountability isn't just about consequences for individuals, it's about addressing the conditions that shaped their actions. A senior pilot from New York who had been quietly observing until now finally spoke. Thomas, I was on SkyDream's first flight 15 years ago. What you're doing now, it's bold, it's costly, and it's absolutely necessary. We've been drifting from our core identity. This is the correction we need. His endorsement seemed to shift the energy of the conversation. Other veteran crew members voiced similar support, while newer employees expressed cautious optimism about the renewal process. As the video conference concluded, Thomas felt the first genuine moment of confidence since implementing Protocol Zero. The challenges ahead remained enormous. The board meeting tomorrow would be particularly difficult, but this direct engagement with frontline employees had confirmed his core conviction: SkyDream's culture needed this reset. The executive team worked late into the night, refining the cultural renewal initiative and preparing for its implementation across the organization. The 72-hour operational pause was structured into 3 phases: Day 1 reflection and honest assessment. Every team would participate in facilitated discussions about the gap between SkyDream's stated values and their lived expression. No scripts, no corporate speak, just honest conversation about where and how the airline had drifted from its founding principles. Day 2. Recommitment and redesign. Employees would collaborate to redesign aspects of their work that had become disconnected from the core value of equal respect, everything from boarding procedures to service scripts to performance metrics. Day 3 integration and relaunch teams would practice implementing their redesigned approaches with the most critical customer-facing roles receiving priority. Flights would gradually resume as teams completed this process. It was an ambitious timeline, perhaps unrealistically so, for complete cultural transformation. But the goal wasn't perfection. It was authentic movement toward the company's original vision. As midnight approached, Thomas finally stepped away from the command center to take a private moment. Finding a quiet corner of the conference facility, he called his sister, Angela Bennett. "I saw the news," she said when she answered, skipping preliminaries. "You actually did it. You grounded the entire airline." "I did," Thomas confirmed. "Mama would be proud," Angela said softly. Standing up for respect was her whole thing. "I know," Thomas replied, feeling the weight of the day's events in a new way, not as the CEO making a bold strategic decision, but as Elaine Bennett's son honoring her legacy. "I just hope the board doesn't fire me tomorrow." Angela's laugh came through the phone. "Let them try. You built that airline from nothing. Besides, from what I'm seeing online, you're about to become a different kind of corporate icon." "What do you mean, check social media when you get a chance?" she advised. The hashtag respect in the sky is trending. People are sharing their own stories of being made to feel unwelcome or unworthy on flights. "You've touched a nerve, Tommy. A good one." As the call ended, Thomas pulled up Twitter to see for himself. Angela was right. Thousands of people were sharing their experiences of being questioned, scrutinized, or made to feel unwelcome in spaces where they had every right to be. The conversation had expanded beyond SkyDream to touch on a universal human desire to be treated with respect regardless of appearance or background. But there was something else too, a counter-narrative emerging in real time. The hashtag #ProtocolZeroFail was gaining traction, with critics calling Thomas's decision woke corporate suicide and virtue signaling at shareholder expense. Financial commentators were predicting doom for SkyDream's stock when markets opened. Some passengers stranded by the operational pause were venting their frustration, questioning whether one incident justified such massive disruption. Thomas scrolled through both streams, taking in the polarized reactions. The situation was evolving into something larger than he had anticipated, not just a corporate crisis, but a cultural lightning rod. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the board meeting, media scrutiny, operational complexities of the pause. But tonight, Thomas Bennett allowed himself a moment of certainty that he had made the right choice, not just for SkyDream, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong in a space they had every right to occupy. Protocol Zero wasn't just about fixing an airline. It was about standing for a principle that transcended business, a principle his mother had taught him from his earliest days. Equal respect was non-negotiable. Have you ever felt unwelcome in a space where you had every right to be? Or have you witnessed someone else being treated this way? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of appearance, make sure to subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. Dawn broke over San Francisco, with a sky as clear and blue as a corporate promise, beautiful, vast, and yet to be tested by the day's developing storms. Thomas Bennett stood at his hotel window, watching the city come alive, while SkyDream remained in suspended animation. All across the country, terminals normally bustling with the airline's signature blue and silver planes sat quiet, a visible testament to the decision he'd made less than 24 hours ago. His phone had barely stopped buzzing since his company-wide address. The media requests had become so numerous that Jennifer had assigned 3 staffers just to catalog them. Every major network newspaper and business publication wanted an exclusive. #respect. In the Sky had been trending all night, joined now by #Protocol Zero and #Thomas Bennett. The story had transcended aviation news to become a national conversation about corporate values, racial bias, and leadership. But the counter-narrative had gained momentum too. #woke, airline failure, and snowflake CEO were trending almost as strongly. Conservative commentators were having a field day portraying Thomas as an oversensitive executive who had tanked his company over a perceived slight. The financial press was uniformly negative, with headlines predicting shareholder revolts and massive stock sell-offs when markets opened. Thomas scrolled through his news alerts. SkyDream CEO grounds entire airline after experiencing discrimination on his own flight. Washington Post protocol. Zero, the most expensive stand-on principle in aviation history. Forbes, Bennett's bold move. Corporate courage or costly miscalculation. Wall Street Journal. First-class discrimination leads to industry-shaking response. CNN, SkyDream stock in freefall as woke CEO throws tantrum over seating dispute. Financial Daily. The range of coverage reflected the deeply divided public reaction. Some lauded Thomas's decision as a refreshing example of a CEO putting values before profit. Others criticized it as an emotional overreaction that would damage shareholders and inconvenience thousands of passengers. Thomas set his phone aside and straightened his tie, preparing for the board meeting scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. Unlike yesterday's impromptu gathering with his executive team, this would be a formal, potentially adversarial confrontation. Eleanor Wright had made her position clear. Protocol Zero was an overreaction that threatened SkyDream's financial stability. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Hector Ramirez, who would accompany Thomas to the meeting. "Ready for the firing squad?" Hector asked with a wry smile. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Thomas replied. "But if it does, I stand by our decision." They rode to SkyDream's San Francisco offices in silence, each preparing for the battle ahead. The car pulled up to a side entrance, avoiding the cluster of reporters gathered at the main doors. Inside the boardroom, the tension was palpable. 8 board members sat around the polished table, expressions ranging from concern to outright disapproval. Eleanor Wright occupied the chair opposite Thomas's usual seat, a subtle but clear positioning of opposition. "Thank you all for convening on such short notice," Thomas began, taking his place. "I understand you have questions about Protocol Zero and the Cultural Renewal Initiative." Eleanor cut straight to the point. "Questions would be an understatement, Thomas. You've unilaterally halted operations, potentially violated fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, and exposed the company to significant liability, all without board consultation. This goes beyond questions to serious concerns about judgment." Several board members nodded in agreement. Thomas noted who did and didn't, mapping the landscape of allies and opponents. "I appreciate your candor, Eleanor," he replied evenly, "and I understand the concerns. Protocol Zero was established as an emergency measure that could be implemented at CEO discretion, specifically because certain situations require immediate action, not committee deliberation. An emergency measure intended for safety crises," Eleanor countered. "Not for customer service incidents, however unfortunate." "What happened yesterday wasn't a customer service incident." Thomas said, his voice hardening slightly. "It was a fundamental breach of our core operating principle, equal respect for all passengers regardless of appearance or background. That principle isn't a marketing slogan. It's the foundation of Sky Dream's existence. James Harrington, the board's most fiscally conservative member, leaned forward with a scowl. Thomas, I've supported you from the beginning. But this is a clear overreaction. We could have fired the flight attendants, issued an apology-enhanced training, grounding the entire airline. It's commercially irresponsible and morally necessary, Thomas countered. Firing individuals doesn't fix a broken culture, and make no mistake, our culture has fractured from its founding principles. For the next 30 minutes, Thomas presented his case methodically, detailing not just yesterday's events, but the pattern of institutional drift they represented, explaining the Cultural Renewal Initiative and outlining the phased resumption of operations over the coming 72 hours. The board listened with varying degrees of receptiveness. When Thomas finished, Richard Chen, another board member, voiced the question on everyone's mind. The financial impact, substantial, Thomas acknowledged. Laura estimates direct costs of $30 to $35 million over the 3-day pause, plus potential longer-term impacts on booking patterns and partner relationships. And you consider this proportionate to the triggering incident? Richard pressed, clearly skeptical. If we frame the issue as one incident, no, Thomas replied honestly. But if we recognize it as a symptom of organizational drift from our core values that differentiate us in the marketplace and justify our premium pricing, then yes, the investment is proportionate to the stake. Eleanor scoffed. Investment. Let's call it what it is, a massive financial hit that our shareholders never agreed to absorb. Our shareholders invested in Sky Dream's vision as well as its balance sheet, Thomas responded. And that vision is non-negotiable. Diane Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. I've been on this board for 12 years, since shortly after Sky Dream's founding. What Thomas is describing, this drift from founding principles, isn't unique to our company. It's the natural entropy that occurs as organizations scale. What's unique is the willingness to address it so boldly. Her support shifted the conversation's tone slightly. Other board members began asking more substantive questions about the Cultural Renewal Initiative, rather than focusing solely on Protocol Zero's costs. Eleanor, sensing the shift, redirected. The press is having a field day with this. Every news outlet is running with the discrimination angle. How do you plan to control the narrative without throwing our flight attendants under the bus? By telling the truth, Thomas said simply. This isn't about villainizing individuals. It's about acknowledging an institutional failure and taking decisive action to correct it. Eleanor's expression suggested she found this approach naive. And when shareholders call for heads to roll, when they demand to know why executives who approved this costly disruption still have jobs. I'll take full responsibility, Thomas replied without hesitation. If someone needs to be held accountable, it's me. I'm the CEO. The cultural drift happened on my watch. The meeting continued for another hour, the conversation gradually shifting from recrimination to pragmatic next steps. While several board members remained skeptical, none moved to formally oppose Protocol Zero, perhaps recognizing that reversing it now would create more problems than it solved. In the end, they reached an uneasy compromise. Thomas would proceed with the Cultural Renewal Initiative, but with enhanced board oversight and more frequent progress reporting. The operational pause would not extend beyond the planned 72 hours without explicit board approval. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor held Thomas back. The board may be reluctantly on board, she said quietly, but this isn't over. The market opens in 20 minutes. Prepare for a bloodbath. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the reality of what was to come. SkyDream's stock had already dropped in pre-market trading. The opening bell would likely bring more significant declines as investors reacted to the operational pause. Outside the boardroom, Hector waited with Jennifer Tate, both looking expectant. We survived, Thomas reported. For now. What's the media situation? Jennifer consulted her tablet. It's intensifying. The morning shows are all running with the story. Social media engagement has tripled overnight. We have requests from every major outlet, but I've scheduled just one, a live interview with National Morning at 11. They've agreed to your conditions, no ambush, focus on the cultural initiative rather than the incident itself. Thomas nodded approval. And our employees, how's the first phase of renewal going? Hector pulled up a real-time dashboard on his tablet. 8,000 employees have completed their reflection sessions already. The facilitators report high engagement, though some defensive reactions in middle management. The anonymous feedback platform is getting heavy use. People are saying things they've apparently wanted to say for years. Good, Thomas said. Real change starts with honest conversation. As they moved to the executive offices, Laura Blackwell intercepted them with grim news. Stock just opened. We're down 22%. Institutional investors are calling for explanations. Goldman downgraded us to underperform. Thomas absorbed this with outward equanimity, though inwardly he felt a flash of doubt. 22% was worse than even their most pessimistic projections, nearly a quarter of the company's market value erased in an instant. Stay the course. The market reacts to quarterly numbers. We're playing a longer game. The next few hours unfolded in a blur of activity. Executive briefings, employee engagement updates, media monitoring, operational logistics for the gradual service resumption. Through it all, Thomas maintained a steady presence, neither minimizing the challenges nor allowing them to overwhelm the core purpose of Protocol Zero. At 11, he sat down for the National Morning interview, his first public statement beyond SkyDream's internal communications. The show's host, Renee Johnson, was known for her direct but fair approach. Mr. Bennett, she began after introductions. You've taken an unprecedented step in grounding an entire airline because of a personal experience with what many are calling racial profiling. Some are calling it courageous leadership. Others see it as an extreme overreaction. How do you respond? Thomas considered his words carefully, aware that millions were watching. First, I want to clarify something important. Protocol Zero wasn't implemented because of what happened to me personally. It was implemented because that incident revealed a gap between our stated values and our actual practices, a gap that needed to be addressed immediately and comprehensively. But surely there were less disruptive ways to address that gap, Renee pressed. Ways that wouldn't strand thousands of passengers and cost millions of dollars. Perhaps, Thomas acknowledged. But sometimes meaningful change requires a clear, decisive break with the status quo. What we're doing isn't just adding another training module or issuing a new policy document. We're fundamentally realigning our entire organization around its core principle, equal respect for all. Your critics are saying this is textbook woke capitalism, prioritizing social justice narratives over shareholder interests, Renee challenged. Your stock is down more than 20% today. Is that a price worth paying for this cultural reset? Thomas felt a moment of hesitation. The stock drop was significantly worse than anticipated, and Renee's framing of the issue echoed the growing conservative backlash online. He took a breath. I reject the premise that treating all customers with equal respect is somehow a radical political position, he replied. This isn't about wokeness. It's about the basic human dignity that every passenger deserves. And yes, we're willing to absorb a temporary financial hit to ensure that SkyDream lives up to that promise. Throughout the 15-minute interview, Thomas maintained this balance, acknowledging the costs and disruption while firmly grounding his decision in principles rather than personality. He neither sensationalized the incident nor minimized its significance. He spoke about institutional accountability without sacrificing individual dignity, even for the flight attendants whose actions had triggered the crisis. As the interview concluded, Renee asked the question on everyone's mind. SkyDream's stock is down significantly today. Shareholders are expressing concerns. Major clients are rebooking with competitors. Are you worried about your job, Mr. Bennett? Thomas smiled slightly. I'm worried about doing my job, Renee. And sometimes doing the right job means making difficult decisions. If standing up for our core principles costs me my position, I can live with that. What I couldn't live with was continuing to lead an organization that had drifted from its founding values. When the cameras stopped rolling, Renee leaned forward. Off the record. That's the most authentic CEO response I've heard in 20 years of interviews. Whatever happens with SkyDream, you've changed the conversation about corporate leadership. Thomas thanked her and rejoined his team, who had been monitoring real-time social media response to the interview. The reaction was deeply divided, some praising Thomas's principles and candor, others condemning what they viewed as virtue signaling at shareholder expense. The polarization is intensifying, Jennifer reported grimly. We're seeing organized campaigns from both sides now. Progressive groups are calling for consumer support of SkyDream, while conservative media figures are encouraging boycotts. This is becoming a full-blown culture war flashpoint. Thomas hadn't anticipated this level of politicization. What he had intended as a principled stand on universal human respect was being reframed through partisan lenses, either as heroic moral leadership or as self-indulgent progressive posturing. Focus on what we can control, he instructed. Our employees, our operations, our commitment to renewal. The public narrative will evolve, but our core mission remains the same. As the day progressed, another unexpected development emerged. Other airlines began issuing statements about their own commitment to respectful service. Some announced new training initiatives. Others promised policy reviews. Whether motivated by genuine values or competitive positioning, the industry was responding to SkyDream's dramatic stand. By evening, another pattern had emerged in the media coverage. The initial wave of sensationalism focused on Thomas as either hero or villain had given way to more substantive analysis of corporate culture, leadership ethics, and the business case for values-driven decision-making. Thomas ended the day where it had begun, standing at a window, this time in his office, watching the sunset paint the sky in gradual transitions of color. SkyDream's stock had closed down 19.4%, significant but not catastrophic. The board remained wary, but hadn't moved to reverse Protocol Zero. Employees were engaging in the renewal process with unexpected enthusiasm. The storm was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, continued scrutiny, and the complex logistics of gradually resuming operations. But Thomas Bennett felt a quiet certainty that Protocol Zero had been the right call, not just for SkyDream, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong in a space where they had every right to be. His phone buzzed with a text from Angela. "Saw your interview. Mama's up there somewhere doing her proud dance." Thomas smiled, imagining his mother's reaction. Elaine Bennett had never sought the spotlight or demanded recognition. She had simply believed in the non-negotiable nature of human respect and taught her son to do the same. That lesson was now transforming not just an airline, but a broader conversation about what we owe each other as human beings. Has someone in your life taught you to stand up for your principles even when it's difficult? Share their story in the comments below. And if this journey of corporate courage inspires you, make sure to subscribe for more stories that challenge business as usual. The second day of Protocol Zero dawned with less fanfare but more substance than the first. The media frenzy continued, but Thomas Bennett's focus had shifted inward to the actual work of cultural renewal rather than its public perception. In a small conference room at SkyDream's San Francisco offices, Thomas sat across from the two flight attendants from Flight 218, Vanessa Thompson and Greg Sullivan. Their presence wasn't publicized. Jennifer had ensured no press knew about this meeting. This wasn't for show. It was for understanding. "Thank you for agreeing to this conversation," Thomas began. "I want to emphasize that this isn't disciplinary. I genuinely want to understand what happened from your perspective. Vanessa sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly on the table. Greg looked equally tense, his usual confidence replaced by evident anxiety. Both had clearly expected termination, not conversation. "I don't understand why I'm here," Vanessa said, her voice tight with tension. "If you're going to fire me, just get it over with." "I've already told you you're not being fired," Thomas replied calmly. "Then what is this, a public humiliation session? So you can tell the press how magnanimous you were to the bigoted flight attendants." The bitterness in her voice was palpable. Thomas was taken aback by the hostility. "That's not. You've already cost the company millions." Vanessa continued, her composure cracking. "You've put thousands of jobs at risk, including mine. All because of what? A misunderstanding. Do you have any idea what it's like to be at the center of this media storm? I've received death threats, Mr. Bennett." Death threats. Thomas hadn't considered the personal toll on Vanessa and Greg. In his focus on the broader cultural issues, he'd overlooked the human impact on the individuals involved. A wave of empathy tempered his earlier certainty. "I'm truly sorry about the threats," he said quietly. "That's inexcusable and will provide security if needed. But I still need to understand what happened on that flight." Vanessa's anger seemed to deflate slightly in the face of his genuine concern. "What do you want me to say? That I'm a racist? I'm not. I've served thousands of passengers of every background." "I don't think you're a racist," Thomas said. "I think you were operating within a system that had developed certain patterns and assumptions. That's what I'm trying to understand." Greg, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. It was the clothes, he said simply. Thomas turned to him. "The clothes? Your clothes. Your briefcase," Greg explained, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. "First-class passengers usually have certain indicators. Designer labels, expensive watches, premium luggage. You didn't have those indicators. It triggered a kind of suspicion algorithm." Thomas nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. "Over time, we've developed these mental shortcuts," Greg said. "They're never stated explicitly in training, but they become part of the culture. Who belongs in first class, who might be trying to upgrade without paying, who needs extra verification. And these shortcuts include appearance," Thomas prompted. "Yes," Greg admitted. "Clothing, quality accessories, and..." He hesitated. "Race." Thomas finished for him. "Not consciously," Greg insisted. "At least not for me. But when multiple factors align, casual clothes, no visible status markers, and yes, being a person of color, it trips a kind of alert system." Vanessa had been watching this exchange, her initial defensiveness giving way to reluctant recognition. "He's right," she finally said. "It's never taught, but it's learned and reinforced." Reinforced how Thomas asked. "By outcomes," she explained. "When we catch someone in the wrong seat class, we get praised. When we give extra attention to passengers who fit the high-value profile, we get better evaluations and tips. The incentives shape the behavior." Thomas was struck by the honesty of their assessment. There was no denying the racial component, but there was also a more complex pattern of institutional incentives that had shaped their actions. "What would have made you treat me differently that day?" he asked. "Besides knowing I was the CEO." Vanessa considered this. If you had been wearing an expensive suit or carrying a premium briefcase or had the confidence of someone who flies first class regularly. She trailed off, seeming to hear what she was saying. "Which shouldn't matter. Not for basic respect." "No," Thomas agreed. "It shouldn't." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Honest, occasionally uncomfortable, but remarkably free of defensiveness on all sides. Thomas wasn't interested in shame or punishment. He wanted understanding. And gradually a clearer picture emerged of how Skydream's culture had subtly shifted over time, creating an environment where Vanessa and Greg's actions seemed reasonable rather than problematic. As they concluded, Thomas made his expectations clear. You'll both participate in the cultural renewal initiative like everyone else. You'll share your insights anonymously if you prefer about the gap between our stated values and our actual practices. And if you're willing to be part of rebuilding something better, there's a place for you at SkyDream. Relief washed visibly over their faces, though Vanessa still seemed guarded. "Why keep us?" she asked directly. "It would be easier to make us the scapegoats." "Because scapegoating is how organizations avoid addressing their real problems," Thomas replied. "And I'm not interested in easy fixes. I'm interested in actual transformation." After Vanessa and Greg departed, Thomas remained in the conference room reflecting on the conversation. Their honesty had been illuminating, confirming his core conviction that Protocol Zero wasn't about a few bad apples, but about a cultural environment that had fostered certain behaviors while discouraging others. His phone buzzed with a text from Angela. "How are you really doing?" "Not the CEO, my brother." The simple question cut through the professional facade Thomas had maintained for the past 48 hours. How was he doing? The truth was more complicated than any public statement or board presentation could capture. He was exhausted physically from the nonstop crisis management, emotionally from carrying the weight of 42,000 employees' livelihoods and thousands of shareholders' investments on his shoulders. He was resolved, certain that Protocol Zero had been the right call despite its enormous costs and the continuing criticism from some quarters. He was reflective, thinking more deeply about his mother's influence on his life and values than he had in years, reconnecting with the foundational purpose that had led him to create SkyDream in the first place. And somewhere underneath it all, he was still processing what had happened on Flight 218, the familiar sting of being seen as suspicious solely because of his appearance, the weight of having to prove his legitimacy yet again, the exhausting reality of navigating spaces where his belonging was questioned rather than assumed. Tired but sure, he texted back to Angela. "Thinking about Mama a lot. She'd say you're doing the hard right thing," came her swift reply. "Coming to town tomorrow. No arguments. You need family right now." Thomas smiled, grateful for his sister's support. Angela had always been his emotional anchor, the one person with whom he could be Thomas the brother rather than Thomas the CEO. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Hector Ramirez, tablet in hand as usual. "Ready for the midday update?" Thomas nodded, shifting back into leadership mode. "Let's hear it. Operations is on track for phased resumption starting tomorrow morning. 18,000 employees have completed their renewal sessions. Employee feedback is trending significantly positive. 85% support for Protocol Zero despite the operational disruption." "And the board?" Thomas asked. Hector's expression tightened slightly. "Mixed. Eleanor is still pushing for a faster restart and a more contained approach to the cultural issues. 3 members seem to be aligning with her position." Thomas absorbed this without surprise. A divided board was always a possibility, especially given the financial implications of Protocol Zero, and our stock still down 18% from pre-protocol levels. The hashtags are getting ugly. Fire Bennett is trending in some circles. Conservative media is having a field day calling this corporate wokeness gone wild. Thomas sighed. The politicization of what he'd intended as a universal human value, equal respect regardless of appearance, was perhaps inevitable in the current climate. But it complicated the path forward, potentially turning a principle everyone should agree on into yet another partisan battleground. Any positive developments, he asked, needing some counterbalance to the negative news. Hector's expression brightened slightly. "Actually, yes. The employee engagement numbers are remarkable. We're seeing participation rates in the renewal sessions at nearly double normal training levels, and the anonymous feedback platform is generating incredibly valuable insights. For the next several hours, Thomas moved through a series of engagements, a video call with station managers about the logistics of restarting operations, a progress review with the cultural renewal facilitators, a brief media availability to provide status updates. Through it all, he maintained the same steady presence that had characterized his leadership since implementing Protocol Zero. As evening approached, Thomas found himself unexpectedly alone, a rare moment of quiet in the storm of activity. On impulse, he canceled his car back to the hotel and instead walked the few blocks to a small park overlooking the bay. Finding an empty bench, he sat down, loosened his tie, and for the first time in 48 hours, simply breathed. The park was quiet at this hour, a few joggers, a couple walking a dog, the distant sounds of the city providing a gentle backdrop. Thomas watched the water its surface catching the last of the day's light in rippling patterns. Mr. Bennett. He looked up to see Maria Gonzalez, the junior flight attendant from Flight 218. She stood a few feet away, clearly surprised to encounter him here. Maria, he acknowledged with a nod. Please join me if you'd like. She hesitated, then sat on the far end of the bench. I didn't mean to disturb you. I live nearby and walk here sometimes after work, or, well, what would normally be work. She smiled nervously. How are you finding the cultural renewal sessions? Thomas asked. Surprising, she admitted. I thought they'd be like regular training, scripted, predictable, but they're actually real conversations. People are saying things they'd never say normally. That's the intention, Thomas replied. Real change requires real honesty. Maria was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Can I ask you something, Mr. Bennett? Not as an employee to the CEO, but just person to person. Of course. Was it worth it? All of this protocol. Zero the stock drop, the media circus for what happened on that flight. It was the question at the heart of everything. The one Thomas had asked himself repeatedly since making his decision. Not in doubt, but in necessary reflection on the proportionality of his response. I don't know, he answered honestly, surprising himself with the admission. I believed it was necessary. I still do. But the cost has been higher than I anticipated, and not just financially. His candor seemed to surprise Maria too. She'd probably expected a confident reaffirmation of his decision, not this moment of vulnerability. My mother used to say that respect isn't something you earn. It's something you already have, something that should be recognized rather than granted. He continued. She cleaned airport floors for 22 years and was rarely treated with the respect she deserved. When I founded SkyDream, I promised myself that everyone who interacted with our airline passengers and employees alike would experience that recognition of their inherent worth. Maria nodded slowly. I remember that from orientation. It's why I wanted to work for SkyDream specifically. But somewhere along the way, Thomas echoed, we began to confuse respect with special treatment. We began to make assumptions about who deserved recognition based on appearance rather than humanity. We didn't just drift from our founding principle, we inverted it. And that's worth halting an entire airline to correct. Maria asked, not skeptically, but genuinely curious. Thomas turned to face her directly. Let me ask you something, Maria. In the moment when Vanessa and Greg were questioning my presence in first class, you spoke up quietly, tentatively, but you did speak up. Why? She considered this. Because it felt wrong. Because I knew what they were doing wasn't about security or procedure. It was about assumptions. And I couldn't just watch it happen. Exactly, Thomas said softly. That instinct to recognize when respect is being compromised and to do something about it, that's what SkyDream was built on. That's what Protocol Zero is protecting. And yes, that's worth temporarily halting an airline to preserve. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the fading light play across the water. Finally, Maria stood to continue her walk. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. for the conversation, but also for doing this, for showing that some things matter more than business as usual. After she left, Thomas remained on the bench reflecting on their exchange. In the midst of crisis management board tensions and media scrutiny, it was easy to lose sight of the human impact, the flight attendant who felt empowered to speak up, the passenger who felt truly welcome for the first time, the employee who saw their company standing firmly for the values it claimed to uphold. Protocol Zero wasn't just about correcting a cultural drift. It was about honoring his mother's legacy, her unshakable belief in the non-negotiable nature of human respect. It was about creating an airline where she would have felt welcome, valued, and acknowledged had she lived to see it. As darkness fell, Thomas finally rose from the bench and began walking back to his hotel. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The phased resumption of operations, continued scrutiny from the board, the complex work of translating renewed commitment into sustained practice. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of an honest conversation with Maria Gonzalez, Thomas Bennett felt a deepening conviction that Protocol Zero, with all its costs and complications, had been the right call. Some principles were worth the price of upholding them. What principles would you be willing to take a stand for, even at significant personal cost? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of principled leadership, make sure to subscribe for the next chapter in this remarkable story. The third day of Protocol Zero dawned with a different energy, less crisis, more purpose. As Thomas prepared for the phased resumption of SkyDream operations, he reflected on how far they had come in 72 hours. First flights resuming in 30 minutes, Hector reported during their morning briefing. We're starting with hub-to-hub routes, 26 departures in the first wave. All crews have completed their renewal sessions. Customer communications have been sent to all affected passengers. Thomas nodded, reviewing the data on his tablet. And the culture renewal teams. Are they positioned at the gates? Yes, Jennifer confirmed. Each departing flight has a facilitator on site to support the crew in implementing their renewed service approaches. We're also gathering real-time feedback from passengers through the new digital platform. Laura Blackwell, who had been skeptical of Protocol Zero initially, now showed cautious optimism. Early financial indicators are stabilizing. The stock recovered 3 points yesterday. Several institutional investors have issued statements of support for our principled stand, though they're still watching closely for operational recovery. The executive team had transformed over the past 72 hours from crisis management to change leadership, from damage control to vision implementation. What had begun as a reactive measure to a disturbing incident had evolved into a proactive reimagining of what SkyDream could be. Let's head to the airport, Thomas suggested. I want to witness the first departures personally. 30 minutes later, they stood in San Francisco International's Terminal 3, watching as SkyDream employees prepared for the first post-Protocol Zero departure flight 901 to Chicago. The difference was immediately noticeable. Gate agents greeted every passenger with the same welcoming attention regardless of ticket class. The boarding process had been redesigned to eliminate the subtle hierarchies that had crept in over the years, still honoring premium ticket priorities, but without the sometimes performative deference that made economy passengers feel like second-class travelers. What you're seeing, Thomas explained to a small group of reporters permitted to observe the restart, is the visible expression of our renewed commitment to equal respect for all. The changes aren't just cosmetic, they reflect a fundamental reorientation of how we approach service. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal raised a skeptical eyebrow. But first-class passengers still board first, still get better seats, still receive premium meals. How is this actually different? The difference, Thomas replied, is that the amenities associated with higher fares are no longer conflated with basic human worth. Yes, a first-class ticket gets you more space, better food, priority boarding, things you pay for. but the fundamental respect with which you're treated, the assumption of belonging, the basic humanity of the interaction that's not tiered. That's universal. On board the aircraft, Vanessa Thompson was serving as lead flight attendant, a deliberate decision that had raised eyebrows among those who expected her to be fired after Flight 218. Instead, she had become a central voice in the renewal process, sharing insights about the unwritten rules and unspoken assumptions that had shaped crew behavior. Her transformation, however, was far from complete. As Thomas observed her interactions with passengers during boarding, he noted moments of tension and uncertainty. The easy confidence of her previous approach had been replaced by a more cautious, deliberate manner. When a casually dressed passenger took his seat in first class, Thomas saw her momentary hesitation, the old instinct to assess and question briefly surfacing before she consciously redirected herself. "Welcome aboard," she greeted Thomas as he performed a final walkthrough before departure. The transformation in her demeanor wasn't about deference to the CEO she now recognized, but about a genuine struggle to reshape ingrained behaviors. "How are you feeling about today?" Thomas asked. "Nervous," she admitted, "but also clearer. Like I finally understand what SkyDream is actually about, not just what we say we're about." She paused, then added with unexpected candor, "I still catch myself making the same assessments, though. It's not easy to rewire patterns that have been reinforced for years." "That's honest," Thomas acknowledged. "And that's exactly what this renewal process is about, recognizing those patterns rather than denying they exist." As the first wave of flights departed successfully, Thomas returned to headquarters for the final executive briefing of the operational pause. The atmosphere in the conference room reflected the journey of the past 72 hours, from crisis to opportunity, from defensive reaction to affirmative recommitment. "Let's review what we've accomplished," Thomas began. "Not just the operational restart, but the fundamental changes we've implemented." Hector pulled up a dashboard showing the comprehensive changes developed during the pause service redesign. Every customer interaction had been reviewed and refined to ensure consistent respect across all touchpoints. Scripts had been eliminated in favor of authentic engagement principles. Performance metrics now emphasized quality of interaction rather than just efficiency. Feedback mechanisms. A new real-time feedback system allowed passengers to share their experiences anonymously with special attention to respect-related concerns. Unlike traditional surveys focused primarily on satisfaction, this system specifically tracked whether passengers felt acknowledged, welcomed, and valued. Training transformation. The entire training program had been rebuilt from first principles, emphasizing not just procedures, but the philosophical underpinnings of SkyDream's approach to service. New employees would understand not just what to do, but why it mattered. Accountability systems. Clear pathways had been established for reporting respect violations with protection for both passengers and employees who raised concerns. Regular cultural audits would ensure continued alignment between stated values and actual practices. Compensation alignment. Performance bonuses now included specific metrics related to equal respect in service, ensuring that financial incentives matched cultural expectations. These changes represent just the beginning, Thomas emphasized. True cultural transformation isn't achieved in 3 days. What we've done is reset our foundation and established mechanisms to maintain our alignment moving forward. Jennifer presented the communications plan for the next phase. "We're framing this not as the end of Protocol Zero, but as the beginning of SkyDream 2.0. The message is forward-looking, not dwelling on what went wrong, but celebrating what comes next." Laura provided the financial update. "We're projecting full operational recovery within 7 days. The direct cost of the pause came in slightly under our initial estimate, $32 million versus the projected $35. Long-term impact remains to be seen, but early booking patterns show minimal disruption." As the briefing concluded, a call came in from Eleanor Wright. Thomas put it on speaker. Eleanor, you're with the executive team. What's the board's perspective on our restart? Cautiously optimistic, she replied, her tone warmer than in previous conversations. The operational resumption appears to be proceeding smoothly. Passenger feedback from the first flights is surprisingly positive, and the media narrative has shifted noticeably from drastic overreaction to bold leadership, and the shareholders Thomas prompted. Still watching closely, Eleanor admitted, but the stock stabilization has calmed the most vocal critics. Your transparency about costs and projected recovery has helped significantly. It wasn't unqualified support, but it represented a meaningful shift from her initial opposition. The board, like the broader organization, was beginning to recognize that Protocol Zero, while costly and disruptive, had catalyzed necessary change. After the call ended, Thomas addressed his executive team one final time before they dispersed to oversee various aspects of the continuing resumption. Protocol Zero officially ends today, he said, but our commitment to its purpose continues. What we've done these past 72 hours isn't a one-time correction, it's a fundamental realignment that will shape everything we do moving forward. The team nodded in understanding and agreement, even Laura, whose initial fiscal concerns had given way to recognition of the long-term value of cultural integrity. As they departed, Hector lingered behind. Thomas, there's something else you should see. He handed over his tablet, displaying a social media trend that had emerged over the past 24 hours. #Respect, pledge. Companies across industries, not just airlines, but hotels, retail chains, tech firms, were publicly committing to examine their own practices around respect and worth. Protocol Zero is transcending SkyDream, Hector observed. It's becoming a model for institutional courage for organizations willing to pause, reflect, and realign when they discover a gap between their stated values and their actual practices. Thomas scrolled through the posts, recognizing the broader impact of what had begun as a response to a single incident on a single flight. This was never just about SkyDream, he said quietly. It was about something more universal, the recognition that equal respect isn't a premium amenity, but a basic human right. Later that afternoon, Thomas visited SkyDream's training center, where new employees were experiencing the redesigned orientation program. Rather than beginning with procedures and policies, the session opened with a simple question. What does respect mean to you? The facilitator noticed Thomas at the back of the room and invited him forward. Would you share what respect means to SkyDream, Mr. Bennett? Thomas hadn't planned to speak, but the question resonated with everything that had transpired over the past 72 hours. He moved to the front of the room, looking out at the faces of new employees, the future of SkyDream. Respect isn't something we give to our passengers, he began. It's something we recognize in them, something that's already there, inherent in their humanity. Our job isn't to grant respect selectively based on ticket class or appearance or status. Our job is to create an environment where that existing worth is acknowledged, valued, and celebrated. He paused, reflecting on his mother's influence. My mother cleaned airport floors for 22 years. She watched thousands of planes take off, but never had the chance to board one herself. When I founded this airline, I promised that we would create a different kind of flying experience, one where every person, regardless of background or appearance, would be treated with the respect they inherently deserve. The room was silent, every new employee engaged with Thomas's words. Protocol Zero was necessary because we had drifted from that founding promise. But what emerges from these past 72 hours isn't just a corrected SkyDream, it's a renewed SkyDream, one that doesn't just say it values equal respect, but actually embeds that value in every aspect of our operation. As Thomas concluded his impromptu remarks, he noticed something unexpected. Maria Gonzalez, standing at the back of the room, now wearing a trainer's badge rather than a flight attendant's uniform. After the session, he approached her. A new role, Maria. She smiled, more confident than she had been in the park 2 days earlier. Cultural Renewal Team. They asked me to help train new employees on recognizing and addressing respect issues in real time. Apparently, speaking up on Flight 218 even belatedly qualified me for the position. "It's perfect," Thomas said sincerely. The quiet voices are often the most important ones, the ones who see clearly but need encouragement to speak. As Thomas prepared to depart for his next engagement, his phone rang Angela arriving at the airport. "Just landed," she reported. And guess what? The gate agent who greeted me was actually looking me in the eye, actually present in the interaction. "Whatever you did these past 3 days, it's working." Thomas smiled, feeling a moment of genuine satisfaction amid the continuing challenges. "There's still a long way to go," he cautioned. "Cultural change isn't achieved in 72 hours. No, Angela agreed, but courage is demonstrated in moments. And from what I'm seeing and hearing, you've shown the kind of courage that changes more than just an airline." That evening, as SkyDream's operations continued their phased resumption across the country, Thomas Bennett stood at the window of his office, watching planes bearing the company's logo take to the skies once more. Each represented not just a successful restart, but a renewed commitment to the principle upon which SkyDream had been founded: equal respect for all. The costs had been substantial financially, operationally, even personally, as Thomas had weathered criticism and scrutiny. The division his decision had created, cast by some as heroic leadership and others as woke posturing, troubled him deeply. What he had intended as a universal human value had become yet another battleground in an increasingly polarized culture. Yet as he observed the aircraft ascending into the evening sky, Thomas Bennett knew one thing with absolute certainty: some principles were non-negotiable. Some promises needed to be kept, especially when doing so was difficult. As twilight deepened, Thomas remembered his mother's words from long ago. "Just once, I want to fly," in grounding an entire airline to protect the equal respect of every passenger. Thomas Bennett had honored not just his mother's dream of flight, but her deeper legacy, the unwavering belief that every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or how they appear. SkyDream was flying again, and this time it was truly living up to its name. What values or principles do you believe are worth standing up for, even at significant personal or professional cost? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore courage, leadership, and human dignity. Respect isn't just a policy, it's a practice. Thomas Bennett's words echoed through the grand ballroom of the National Business Ethics Conference, where he had just concluded his keynote address. 1 month after Protocol Zero, the SkyDream CEO had been invited to share the story that had transformed not just an airline, but sparked a broader conversation about corporate values and institutional courage. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just polite recognition, it was an acknowledgement of something rare in corporate leadership: the willingness to place principle above profit, even at significant cost. As Thomas stepped away from the podium, a familiar face approached Sarah Anderson, the HR consultant who had witnessed and recorded the original incident on Flight 218. "I've been following SkyDream's journey closely," she said, extending her hand. "What you've built over the past month is remarkable." Thomas accepted the handshake with a smile. "We're still building it. Cultural change is a continuous process, not a one-time event. That's precisely why it's working," Sarah observed. "Most companies treat these issues as PR problems to be managed rather than cultural challenges to be addressed. They moved toward the reception area where business leaders from across industries mingled over coffee and conversation. Many nodded respectfully as Thomas passed. Others approached with questions about specific aspects of SkyDream's Cultural Renewal Initiative. The airline's approach had become something of a case study in authentic organizational transformation. Mr. Bennett called a voice from behind. Thomas turned to see William Crawford, the skeptical first-class passenger from Flight 218 who had questioned the proportionality of Protocol Zero. "I didn't expect to see you here. I'm speaking on a panel about shareholder value and ethical leadership," Crawford explained, "and I owe you an apology. I thought you were overreacting that day. I was wrong." The admission was clearly not easy for Crawford, a successful executive accustomed to being right. Thomas appreciated the humility it represented. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "I flew SkyDream last week," Crawford replied. "I've been a Platinum member for years, but this was the first time I actually felt like I was experiencing the airline you originally set out to build. The difference was palpable." Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what Crawford meant. In the month since Protocol Zero, SkyDream had meticulously implemented the changes developed during those intensive 72 hours. The results were increasingly evident not just in passenger feedback, but in employee engagement, operational metrics, and even financial performance. The conversation with Crawford was interrupted by a text from Hector Flight 218, ready for your review. "Same route, same crew. Transformation remarkable." Thomas excused himself, promising to continue the conversation with Crawford later. This flight review was one he had been particularly interested in, a deliberate recreation of the conditions that had triggered Protocol Zero, now being used as a measure of how far SkyDream had come. In a private conference room, Thomas connected to the secure feed. Flight 218 San Francisco to New York was midway through its journey. The same crew, including Vanessa Thompson and Greg Sullivan, was serving a diverse mix of passengers. But the dynamics couldn't have been more different. Vanessa moved through the cabin with a transformed presence, attentive to each passenger regardless of appearance or ticket class, her interactions authentic rather than performative. Greg, who had struggled more with the cultural shift, was nonetheless demonstrating a new awareness in his service approach. Most striking was a scene at the front of first class. A young black woman in casual clothes was being served with exactly the same respect and attentiveness as the silver-haired executive beside her. No questioning glances, no subtle scrutiny, no unspoken implications about belonging. Thomas watched for several minutes, noting the natural flow of the service, the absence of the hierarchical dynamics that had once characterized SkyDream's premium cabins. This wasn't performance for the camera. It was authentic cultural change manifested in daily practice. Yet even as he observed these positive changes, Thomas couldn't ignore the personal toll Protocol Zero had taken. The past month had been the most challenging of his career, not just professionally, but physically and emotionally as well. His phone buzzed again, this time with SkyDream's daily performance dashboard. Thomas scanned the metrics with satisfaction. Customer Respect Score, the new feedback metric tracking passengers' sense of being valued. 92% positive, up from 74% pre-protocol. 0 employee engagement, 88%, a record high. Operational performance, on-time departures improved by 6%, as artificial hierarchies gave way to more efficient processes. Financial recovery. Stock price recovered to 93% of pre-protocol Zero levels, with analyst projections now trending positive. The dashboard included a quote from a passenger survey. "For the first time in my traveling life, I wasn't made to feel like I needed to prove I belonged in first class. Thank you for creating an environment where respect isn't a luxury amenity." Thomas closed the dashboard with a sense of quiet pride. The road to this point hadn't been easy. The board meeting following Protocol Zero had been tense, with some directors questioning his judgment. Shareholders had expressed concern over the short-term financial impact. Competitors had attempted to capitalize on the disruption. The polarization had taken a personal toll as well. Thomas had received death threats from extremists who viewed Protocol Zero as woke capitalism gone mad. Conservative media figures had called for boycotts of SkyDream, while progressive activists had sometimes weaponized the airline's stance in ways that made Thomas uncomfortable. What he had intended as a universal human value equal respect regardless of appearance had been subsumed into broader culture war narratives. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the fatigue of the past month. His doctor had warned him about his blood pressure and stress levels. Angela had noted with concern that he'd lost weight and wasn't sleeping well. The constant pressure of public scrutiny combined with the enormous responsibility of guiding Skydream through this transformation had exacted a physical price. But as the tangible results of cultural renewal became increasingly evident, the skepticism had gradually given way to support. Eleanor Wright, once Thomas's most vocal critic on the board, had recently admitted that Protocol Zero might have been exactly the reset Skydream needed, though the method was unconventional. Thomas's reflections were interrupted by another text, this one from Angela. "Have you seen the memorial wall? Third floor east corridor." Curious. Thomas made his way through the conference center to the location his sister had specified. There he found a temporary installation created by the conference organizers, voices of respect displayed on an expansive digital wall. Thousands of social media posts scrolled slowly across the screen, each sharing a personal story of standing up for worth and respect in various contexts: workplaces, schools, public spaces. As Thomas watched, he recognized the hashtag that had emerged from Protocol Zero #, Respect Everywhere. What had begun as a response to a specific incident on a single flight had catalyzed a broader conversation about how human dignity was recognized, honored, or denied in daily interactions across society. "Your mother would be proud," said a voice beside him. Angela had joined him at the display, her eyes reflecting the scrolling stories. "You didn't just change an airline, you changed the conversation." Thomas squeezed his sister's hand, feeling the emotional weight of what Skydream's stand had come to represent beyond the company itself. "I was just trying to honor her legacy," he said quietly. "And look what came of it," Angela replied, gesturing to the wall of stories. All these people finding their voices, standing up for their own worth and that of others. As they stood there, Thomas's phone rang, Vanessa Thompson calling from Flight 218. He stepped away to take the call. "Mr. Bennett." Vanessa began, her voice conveying both professionalism and genuine warmth. "I know you're monitoring our flight today. I wanted you to know that we just had a situation, a passenger in economy experiencing severe anxiety. We moved her to an empty first-class seat where she could have more space and privacy." "That sounds like good service," Thomas replied. "What I wanted you to know," Vanessa continued, "is that before Protocol Zero, I wouldn't have done that. I would have worried about devaluing the first-class experience for the paying passengers. I would have prioritized perceived exclusivity over human need." Thomas understood exactly what she was describing, the subtle shift in values that had once shaped decision-making throughout the organization. "The passenger is a young teacher traveling to visit her sick father," Vanessa added. "When I moved her to first class, she started crying, not just from her anxiety, but because she said she'd never been treated with such kindness on a flight before." As Vanessa continued describing the interaction, Thomas recognized the true measure of Skydream's transformation. It wasn't just about avoiding discrimination or preventing negative incidents. It was about creating a culture where genuine human respect shaped every decision and interaction. After finishing the call, Thomas rejoined Angela at the Voices of Respect wall. Ready to head back to the hotel, she asked, noting the fatigue in her brother's face. "Not yet," Thomas replied, wincing slightly as he adjusted his position. The stress of the past month had manifested in a persistent back pain that his doctor attributed to tension. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Angela observed with concern. "The stock is almost recovered. The airline is operating smoothly. The cultural changes are working. Maybe it's time to delegate more." Thomas nodded absently, still watching the stories scroll across the wall. The truth was, the past month had drained him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The constant public scrutiny, the polarized reactions, the pressure of justifying a decision that had cost millions, all had taken their toll. Some nights he'd lain awake wondering if he'd gone too far, if there might have been a less dramatic way to address the cultural drift he'd identified. "You know," Angela said after a moment, "Mama would be the first to tell you that taking care of yourself is part of honoring her legacy, too." Thomas smiled ruefully. "She always did say I was stubborn like Dad." "Worse," Angela countered with a smile. At least he knew when to take a break. As they finally left the conference center, Thomas felt the familiar buzz of his phone. Another crisis, another decision, another demand on his limited reserves. For a brief moment, he considered ignoring it. The cost of Protocol Zero had been not just financial, but deeply personal, and he was beginning to recognize the need for his own renewal alongside the company's. Yet as he stood there watching thousands of people share their own experiences of standing up for dignity and respect, inspired at least in part by SkyDream's example, Thomas Bennett felt an unshakable certainty that it had all been worth it. Some principles transcended business calculations. Some values were worth defending even at significant cost. And the recognition of human dignity wasn't a luxury to be selectively extended, but a fundamental right to be universally honored. 1 month after the most consequential decision of his career, Thomas Bennett watched SkyDream's transformation ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the confines of aircraft cabins and airport terminals. His mother had cleaned floors at JFK for 22 years, dreaming of a day when the sky would be truly accessible to everyone. In grounding an entire airline to protect the equal respect of every passenger, Thomas had not just honored her dream, he had expanded it beyond anything she might have imagined. Have you ever had to make a difficult stand on principle? How did it affect you personally, even if it was the right thing to do? Share your experience in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and leadership in action. 6 weeks after Protocol Zero, Thomas Bennett stood on the observation deck at JFK's Terminal 4, watching aircraft from dozens of airlines taxi, take off, and land in the crisp autumn morning. This was where his mother had worked for 2 decades, where she had paused each night to watch planes she would never board, where the dream of SkyDream had first taken root in her son's imagination. Today he was here for the formal unveiling of the Elaine Bennett Respect Initiative, a multi-airline collaboration designed to transform service culture across the entire aviation industry. Mr. Bennett called a familiar voice. James Wilson, the executive who had witnessed the original incident on Flight 218, approached with an extended hand. "Quite a turnout today." Thomas nodded, taking in the gathering crowd of airline executives, industry regulators, and media representatives. What had begun as SkyDream's internal transformation had sparked something much larger, a movement toward reimagining the relationship between airlines and passengers, between service providers and service recipients. "I didn't expect such broad industry participation," Thomas admitted, suppressing a wince as he shifted position. The back pain that had begun a month ago had become a constant companion, a physical manifestation of the stress he'd been under. "Especially from our competitors." "That's the interesting thing about courage," James replied. "It's contagious. When one leader stands firmly on principle, it creates space for others to do the same." The observation deck had been transformed for the occasion. A podium stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, with the New York skyline and active runways providing a dynamic backdrop. Chairs arranged in neat rows were filling with attendees, CEOs from major carriers' union representatives, consumer advocates, even flight attendants like Vanessa and Greg, who had played pivotal roles in SkyDream's transformation. Jennifer Tate appeared at Thomas's side. "We're ready to begin," she said, unable to hide her excitement. What had initially been conceived as a modest industry event had evolved into something far more significant, a public commitment by 17 airlines to adopt the core principles of SkyDream's Cultural Renewal Initiative. As Thomas took his place at the podium, he surveyed the assembled crowd. The journey from Protocol Zero to this moment had been remarkable, not just in its scope, but in its pace. What might have taken years of gradual advocacy had instead unfolded in weeks, catalyzed by a single bold stand that captured the public imagination. 6 weeks ago, Thomas began his voice slightly hoarse from too many speeches and too little rest. SkyDream. Airlines took an unprecedented step, grounding our entire fleet to address a fundamental disconnect between our stated values and our lived practices. What began as a response to a specific incident has evolved into something much larger, a reconsideration of how human worth shapes the travel experience for everyone involved. He outlined the tangible results of SkyDream's transformation: improved passenger satisfaction, enhanced employee engagement, even strengthened financial performance as the airline's authentic commitment to equal respect attracted a growing base of loyal customers. But this isn't just about SkyDream, Thomas continued. It's about recognizing that human worth isn't a competitive advantage to be hoarded by one carrier. It's a fundamental value that should shape our entire industry. As he spoke, representatives from participating airlines nodded in agreement. What had begun as a potentially isolated corporate crisis had become a catalyst for industry-wide reflection and reform. The Elaine Bennett Respect Initiative, named for Thomas's mother, would establish shared standards, collaborative training approaches, and mutual accountability mechanisms across participating carriers. My mother cleaned the floors of this very terminal for 22 years, Thomas said, his voice softening slightly. She watched thousands of planes take off, but never had the chance to board one herself. When I founded SkyDream, I promised that we would create a different kind of flying experience, one where every person, regardless of background or appearance, would be treated with the respect they inherently deserve. He gestured toward the active runways visible through the windows behind him. Today, that promise expands beyond a single airline to encompass a vision for the entire industry. The Elaine Bennett Respect Initiative isn't just about preventing negative experiences. It's about creating consistently positive ones grounded in the recognition of every passenger's inherent worth. As Thomas concluded his remarks, the ceremony transitioned to the formal signing of the initiative's founding document. One by one, representatives from participating airlines approached the podium, adding their signatures to a commitment that would reshape training protocols, service standards, and accountability mechanisms across much of the global aviation industry. The media captured each signature, broadcasting the event live across multiple platforms. Social media buzzed with commentary, the majority supportive of this visible commitment to industry-wide change. Yet beneath the public success of the initiative, Thomas was privately grappling with the aftermath of his decision. The board was pressing for a clear succession plan, concerned about what some members described as his increasingly evident burnout. His doctor had been blunt during his last checkup. His blood pressure, stress levels, and weight loss all pointed toward a health crisis if he didn't make changes. When the ceremony concluded, Thomas found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Among them was a face he didn't immediately recognize, an older gentleman in an airport maintenance uniform. "Mr. Bennett," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "My name is Robert Jackson. I worked maintenance here alongside your mother for 15 years. Thomas's expression registered surprise and then genuine pleasure. "Mr. Jackson, my mother spoke of you often. Elaine was the hardest worker I ever knew," Robert said, his eyes crinkling with the memory. "Always dignified, always proud of what she did, even when passengers walked right past her like she was invisible." Thomas nodded, remembering his mother's unwavering self-respect even in the face of others' disregard. "She taught me that dignity comes from within, but respect should come from others." "She'd be proud today," Robert said simply. "Seeing her name up there, knowing it will help change how people are treated in these skies." He glanced toward the windows where planes continued their choreographed dance of arrivals and departures. "She's watching, you know. Probably giving that little nod she always did when something was done right." The unexpected connection to his mother's world brought a wave of emotion that Thomas hadn't anticipated. He thanked Robert warmly, promising to stay in touch and perhaps gather more stories about Elaine's years at JFK. As the crowd dispersed and the observation deck returned to its usual function, Thomas lingered for a final moment, looking out at the runways where aircraft bearing the SkyDream logo now taxied alongside those of airlines that had once been just competitors, but were now partners in a shared commitment to respect. Jennifer joined him at the window. "The media coverage is extraordinary," she reported. "Every major outlet is running with the story. The narrative has completely shifted from CEO's overreaction to visionary leadership that transformed an industry." Thomas nodded, acknowledging the update without being defined by it. The public perception mattered, certainly. It created space for the actual work of transformation to continue. But the true measure of success wasn't headlines or accolades. It was the daily experience of passengers and employees across the aviation ecosystem. "The board just approved the final component of our cultural renewal initiative." Jennifer continued. "The Dignity Scholarship Fund will provide aviation career opportunities to underrepresented communities, including full funding for pilot training, maintenance, certification, and management education." This final piece had been particularly meaningful to Thomas, creating pathways for people like his mother to move from cleaning airport floors to occupying positions of influence within the industry. It wasn't just about changing how existing participants behaved. It was about changing who got to participate in the first place. "There's something else," Jennifer added, her tone shifting. "The board would like to meet next week to discuss your health concerns." Thomas wasn't surprised. His physical decline had become increasingly apparent. The weight loss, the constant fatigue, the barely concealed pain that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. "They're worried," Jennifer continued. "We all are. You've given everything to make Protocol Zero work, but at what cost?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. The personal toll of the past 6 weeks had been substantial, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically as well. The polarized public reaction, the death threats, the constant scrutiny, the weight of responsibility for 42,000 employees, and an industry-wide transformation. It had all exacted a price. "I'll talk to them," he finally said, "but not until the initiative is fully operational." As they prepared to depart, Thomas noticed a young black girl with her mother at the far end of the observation deck, watching planes with the same wonder he had once felt. Something in her expression, the pure joy of possibility, reminded him of what aviation represented at its best: the transcendence of boundaries, the connection of distant worlds, the expansion of human potential. In that moment, Thomas Bennett felt the full circle of his journey from the son of an airport cleaner dreaming impossible dreams to the industry leader whose principled stand had catalyzed meaningful change. Protocol Zero had been costly, controversial, and undeniably disruptive. But its impact now extended far beyond SkyDream to touch countless lives across the global aviation community. As he turned to leave, Thomas caught a final glimpse of a SkyDream aircraft lifting into the clear autumn sky, its wings gleaming in the morning sunlight. In his mind's eye, he could see his mother watching a similar plane decades earlier, whispering her modest dream, "Just once, I want to fly." Today, her legacy was helping ensure that everyone who entered that sky would do so with their dignity intact. It was a fitting tribute to a woman who had never sought recognition, but had taught her son the uncompromising value of respect for every human being. The Elaine Bennett Respect Initiative would carry that lesson forward, transforming not just procedures and practices, but the very culture of an industry that touched millions of lives daily. And it had all begun with a single courageous decision to stand firm when respect was compromised. Some principles, Thomas reflected as he left the observation deck, truly were non-negotiable. And standing up for those principles, even at significant cost, could create ripples of change that extended far beyond one's immediate horizon. The sky belonged to everyone. Today it was a little more accessible, a little more welcoming, a little more just. Have you witnessed a moment when one person's principled stand created positive changes that affected many others? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and transformation. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning light, dew still clinging to the grass as Thomas Bennett followed the familiar path to his mother's resting place. 6 months had passed since Protocol Zero, and he had come today on what would have been Elaine Bennett's 75th birthday to share the journey her legacy had inspired. He carried his father's worn leather briefcase, the initials TB barely visible after decades of use. Inside was a small collection of news clippings, photographs, and letters, tangible evidence of how a principled stand taken 6 months ago had expanded into something neither he nor his mother could have imagined. Thomas moved more slowly than he once had, his body still recovering from the physical toll the past 6 months had taken. 3 weeks after the launch of the Elaine Bennett Respect Initiative, he had collapsed during a board meeting, his body finally surrendering to the relentless stress he'd been under. The diagnosis had been sobering extreme exhaustion, dangerously high blood pressure, and the early warning signs of heart problems. The board had been unanimous. Thomas would take a 3-month medical leave, effective immediately. In his absence, Hector Ramirez had stepped in as interim CEO, guiding SkyDream with steady competence while Thomas focused on his health. The forced rest had been difficult for someone accustomed to constant activity, but gradually Thomas had begun to heal physically and mentally. Now, returning part-time to his role as CEO, he had a new appreciation for the importance of sustainable leadership. Standing for principles didn't require sacrificing oneself entirely. Finding the simple headstone, Thomas set down a bouquet of white lilies, Elaine's favorite, before taking a seat on the small bench he had installed years earlier. This was his ritual, these private conversations with the woman whose values had shaped his life and ultimately an entire industry. "Hello, Mama," he said softly. "I brought some things to show you." From the briefcase, he withdrew a magazine cover featuring the Elaine Bennett Respect Initiative, now implemented across 23 airlines, serving over 800 million passengers annually. The article described the initiative as the most significant cultural transformation in aviation history, originating from a single act of principled leadership. "Your name is on training materials in airports around the world," Thomas said with quiet pride. "Flight attendants in Tokyo, ground staff in London, pilots in Dubai. They all learn about respect through a program bearing your name." He shared more updates, passenger testimonials about transformed travel experiences, statistics showing improved satisfaction across all demographics. Industry awards recognizing the initiative's impact. SkyDream itself had recovered fully from the financial impact of Protocol Zero, its stock now trading at an all-time high, as passengers increasingly chose the airline known for its authentic commitment to human dignity. "Remember when you told me that respect isn't something given but something recognized?" Thomas continued. "That lesson changed more than just an airline mama. It changed how millions of people experience travel. And it all started because you taught me that some principles are non-negotiable." A gentle breeze stirred the cemetery's trees, sending dappled light across the headstone's simple inscription, "Elaine Marie Bennett, 1950 to 2015. Her dignity lifted others." Thomas fell silent for a moment, remembering his mother's quiet strength, her unwavering self-respect even when others failed to see her value. She had cleaned airport floors with the same care and attention that surgeons brought to operating rooms, believing that all work had dignity when performed with integrity. "There's something else," Thomas said, finally withdrawing a letter bearing official government seals. "The Department of Transportation is establishing new regulatory standards based on the Respect Initiative. They're calling it the Bennett Framework Minimum Standards for Respectful Treatment that will apply to every airline operating in U.S. airspace." The policy implications of Protocol Zero had extended far beyond voluntary corporate commitments to reshape the regulatory environment itself. What had begun as one CEO's principled stand in a first-class cabin had evolved into structural change affecting an entire industry. But the most meaningful impact wasn't captured in regulations or statistics or corporate initiatives. It lived in the daily experiences of individuals who no longer had to prove they belonged in spaces they had every right to occupy. Thomas shared one final item from his briefcase, a handwritten letter from a young black girl who had flown for the first time on Skydream. "The flight attendant made me feel special," she had written. "Not because I got special treatment, but because she treated me like I mattered just as much as everyone else." "That's your legacy," Mama Thomas said softly, his voice catching slightly. "Not just in programs or policies or principles, but in moments like these, when someone who might once have been made to feel they didn't belong, instead feels fully welcomed." As morning sunlight strengthened around him, Thomas thought about the journey of the past 6 months. Protocol Zero had been the most controversial decision of his career, grounding an entire airline over what some had dismissed as a single unfortunate incident. The financial costs had been substantial, the organizational disruption significant, the public scrutiny intense. Yet from that moment of institutional courage had emerged something remarkable, not just a reformed airline, but a transformed industry, not just improved procedures, but elevated standards, not just better service, but deeper respect for the inherent dignity of every traveler. The personal cost had been high as well. Thomas's health had suffered his resilience tested by the polarized reactions and the immense pressure of leading such a visible transformation. The path back to wellness had been gradual, requiring a fundamental reassessment of his approach to leadership and life itself. But sitting here now in the quiet cemetery where his mother rested, Thomas Bennett felt a deep sense of peace that transcended both the professional accolades and the personal challenges of the past 6 months. He had honored his mother's legacy not just through words, but through actions that had changed lives. Thomas closed his briefcase, the weathered leather a reminder of continuity across generations, his grandfather's determination, his father's diligence, his mother's dignity, his own commitment to carrying their values forward. "I kept my promise, Mama," he said, rising from the bench. "I built an airline where you would have been welcomed, respected, valued, where everyone is. And now that vision has gone far beyond anything we could have imagined." As Thomas walked back through the cemetery toward the waiting car, he moved with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned that principles endure even when we pause to care for ourselves. His partial return to work reflected a new wisdom that sustainable leadership required balance, that standing for values didn't necessitate personal sacrifice to the point of collapse. The morning sun caught the worn leather briefcase, illuminating the faded initials that had witnessed his journey from the son of an airport cleaner to an industry leader whose principled stand had changed far more than just an airline. In that golden light, Thomas Bennett carried forward not just his mother's legacy, but the enduring truth she had lived by: dignity, recognized and respected, lifted everyone higher than any aircraft could fly. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring true stories to light. Share your own experiences standing up for respect in the comments below. We read every comment and would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release our next powerful story of courage and transformation that's changing our world for the better.